Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. I've been hiking the White Mountains of New Hampshire for over 15 years, and I thought I knew every trail, every ridge, every hidden valley in the region. I'm the kind of hiker who studies topographic maps like other people read novels, and I pride myself on never getting lost, never taking a wrong turn, never ending up anywhere I didn't plan to be. That confidence is what makes what happened to me in September of 2022 so difficult to accept, so impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't there. I was doing a solo day hike on the Franconia Ridge Trail, a route I'd completed at least a dozen times before. It's a challenging but well-marked trail that leads to some of the most spectacular views in New England, and it's popular enough that you're rarely alone on the mountain. I'd started early that morning from the Lafayette Place campground, planning to hike up to Mount Lafayette, across the ridge to Mount Lincoln, and then loop back via the Falling Waters Trail. The weather was perfect for hiking. Clear skies, cool temperatures, the kind of crisp September day that makes you remember why you love spending time in the mountains. I'd made good time on the ascent, reaching the tree line in about 2 hours, and enjoying the increasingly expansive views as I climbed higher. Other hikers were scattered along the trail, and I exchanged the usual pleasantries with fellow outdoors enthusiasts who were enjoying the same beautiful day. I reached the summit of Mount Lafayette around noon and spent 20 minutes taking photos and eating lunch while enjoying the panoramic views that stretched across 3 states. The visibility was exceptional. I could see Mount Washington to the northeast, the Connecticut River Valley to the west, and the endless expanse of forest-covered mountains rolling away in every direction. When I started across the ridge toward Mount Lincoln, following the well-worn path that thousands of hikers use every year, everything was exactly as it should have been. The trail was clearly marked with white blazes painted on rocks, and I could see other hikers both ahead of me and behind me on the exposed ridge. But somewhere during that traverse, something went wrong in a way that I still can't fully understand. I remember passing the junction where a side trail branches off toward the Greenleaf Hut, and I remember continuing straight toward Lincoln as I'd planned. But at some point, and I can't pinpoint exactly when, I realized that I couldn't see any other hikers on the trail ahead of or behind me. The mountain ridge that had been dotted with colorful backpacks and hiking poles just minutes before was suddenly empty. At first, I wasn't concerned. Hikers spread out naturally on long trails, and it's not unusual to find yourself alone for stretches, especially if you're moving at a different pace than the groups around you. But as I continued along what I thought was the familiar ridge trail, the landscape began to look different in subtle ways that I couldn't quite identify. The trail was still there, still marked with white blazes, but the terrain around it seemed wrong somehow. The ridgeline was broader than I remembered, with gentle undulations that didn't match the topography I knew from previous hikes. The views to either side were spectacular but unfamiliar. I could see mountain ranges that stretched to horizons that were too distant, valleys that were too deep and too green, forests that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. I stopped and pulled out my map and compass, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere despite the clear trail markings. But according to my compass, I was heading in the right direction, and the elevation readings on my GPS unit seemed consistent with where I should have been on the ridge. Yet the landscape around me didn't match anything on my topographic map. The mountains I could see in the distance were the right general shape and orientation, but they seemed larger, more dramatic, with peaks that rose higher than anything shown on my charts. The valleys between them were deeper and more complex, with what appeared to be lakes and rivers in places where my map showed only continuous forest. It was as if I were looking at a more expansive, more pristine version of the White Mountains, one that existed on a grander scale than the region I thought I knew. I continued hiking, assuming that I would eventually reach a familiar landmark that would help me reorient myself. But the trail kept leading through terrain that became increasingly unfamiliar. I crossed streams that weren't marked on my map, passed through stands of trees that seemed older and larger than any I'd seen in New England, and climbed over small ridges that offered views of landscapes that looked like they belonged in the Canadian Rockies rather than New Hampshire. The strangest part was how pristine everything appeared. In the real White Mountains, you can usually see some evidence of human presence: distant roads, power lines, the cleared areas around ski resorts, the scarred slopes where logging has taken place. But in this landscape, there were no signs of civilization anywhere. The forest stretched unbroken to every horizon, and the mountains rose from valley floors that showed no indication they had ever been touched by human activity. After hiking for what felt like several hours through this impossible terrain, I began to feel genuinely concerned about my situation. My GPS unit was giving readings that didn't correspond to any location on my maps, and my cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in the mountains, but added to my growing sense of isolation. I was carrying enough water and food for a day hike, but if I was truly lost in unfamiliar territory, I needed to start thinking about getting back to known landmarks before dark. I decided to retrace my steps, following the trail back in the direction I had come, but the trail that had brought me to this strange landscape seemed to have changed during my passage. The white blazes were still there, still pointing the way, but they were leading through terrain that I didn't remember hiking through earlier. The ridgeline I followed back was different from the one I had walked across, with different views and different vegetation. As I hiked back, the landscape gradually began to look more familiar. The mountains in the distance slowly returned to their proper proportions. The valleys resumed their expected depths, and the forests took on the appearance of the New England wilderness I knew. After about an hour of backtracking, I encountered other hikers again, a couple with day packs who looked as normal and ordinary as any weekend hikers I'd ever met. I asked them if they'd seen me earlier on the ridge, describing my route and the approximate time I would have passed them. But they looked confused and said they'd been on the trail for the past 3 hours, without seeing anyone matching my description. According to them, I would have had to pass them to be where I was, but they had no memory of encountering me on their hike. I continued retracing my route until I reached the summit of Mount Lafayette again, where I found several groups of hikers enjoying the views and taking photos. The mountain looked exactly as it had when I'd left it, with the same familiar peaks visible in the distance and the same well-worn trail markers and rock cairns. But I had no clear memory of how I'd gotten from this normal, recognizable place to the expanded landscape I'd been hiking through. I completed my planned loop via the Falling Waters Trail without further incident, returning to my car at the campground as the sun was setting. The hike down was routine and familiar, following well-marked trails through terrain that matched my maps perfectly. But I kept thinking about those hours I'd spent in a landscape that seemed like an enhanced version of the mountains I thought I knew, a place where everything was the same, but somehow more than it should have been. I've returned to the Franconia Ridge Trail several times since then, always following the same route, always looking for the junction or wrong turn that might lead me back to that impossible landscape. But every hike has been completely normal, taking me across the familiar ridge with its expected views and well-documented terrain. The trail goes exactly where it's supposed to go, leading through mountains that match their descriptions in guidebooks and their representations on topographic maps. I've studied satellite images of the area, looking for hidden valleys or unmapped terrain that might explain what I experienced. I've researched the geological history of the region, thinking that maybe I'd somehow encountered a landscape feature that isn't widely known or documented. I've even consulted with other experienced hikers and trail guides, describing my experience as carefully as I can without sounding like I'd suffered from altitude sickness or heat exhaustion. But none of my research has provided a satisfactory explanation for what happened during those hours when I was lost in versions of the White Mountains that was simultaneously familiar and impossible. The landscape I hiked through was too detailed, too consistent, too real to have been a hallucination. Yet it was also too different from the documented geography of New Hampshire to exist in the world we map and measure and think we understand. I've come to believe that there are places in our most familiar landscapes that exist alongside the terrain we know, accessible only under certain conditions or by certain kinds of mistake. Perhaps getting lost isn't always about taking a wrong turn on a marked trail. Perhaps sometimes it's about stepping sideways into a version of the world that's hidden just beneath the surface of the place we think we're exploring. The mountains keep their secrets, and I suspect that many hikers have found themselves in landscapes that don't appear on any map, walking trails that lead through terrain that's simultaneously real and impossible. Most of us probably find our way back to the familiar world without ever understanding what we've briefly experienced. We dismiss the inconsistencies, rationalize the impossibilities, and continue with our planned routes through the mountains we think we know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm planning future hikes, I find myself studying the topographic maps differently. I look for the spaces between the contour lines, the gaps in our documented knowledge, the places where a trail might lead somewhere other than its marked destination. And I wonder if I'll ever again take a wrong turn that leads me back to that pristine, expanded version of the White Mountains, where the peaks rise higher and the forests stretch farther than any map has ever recorded. The possibility both terrifies and thrills me, because once you've walked through a landscape that exists beyond the boundaries of our measured world, you never stop looking for the hidden trails that might take you back there. We were 3 nights into a backpacking trip in the Olympic National Forest when something in the darkness began calling to us using our own voices. My 2 friends, Jake and Sarah, and I had hiked about 8 miles into the backcountry to reach a remote camping area beside a small alpine lake, far from any trails or other campers. It was exactly the kind of isolation we'd been looking for, a place to disconnect from civilization and enjoy the profound quiet that comes with being truly alone in wilderness. The first 2 nights had been perfect. We'd set up our tents in a clearing about 50 yards from the lake shore, with enough space between our individual shelters to give everyone privacy while maintaining the security that comes with camping as a group. The area was beautiful and peaceful, surrounded by old-growth forest and offering spectacular views of the surrounding peaks reflected in the still water. On Wednesday night, our third evening at the lake, we were sitting around our camp stove after dinner, talking quietly and enjoying the stars that were becoming visible as full darkness settled over the mountains. The conversation was typical for our group: discussions about work, plans for future hiking trips, and the kind of relaxed banter that develops between friends who've spent years exploring wilderness areas together. Around 10 p.m., we heard Jake's voice calling from the direction of the forest, maybe 100 yards from our campsite. "Hey, come check this out," the voice called, using Jake's distinctive tone and speech patterns. "I found something really interesting over here." The 3 of us looked at each other in confusion, because Jake was sitting right there beside the camp stove, obviously not calling to us from the woods. The voice had been identical to Jake's in every way: same pitch, same inflection, same casual way of speaking that we'd been hearing all evening around the campfire. "That wasn't me," Jake said, his expression shifting from puzzlement to concern. "That was definitely my voice, but I didn't say anything." We sat quietly, listening for any additional sounds from the forest. After a few minutes, Sarah's voice came from a different direction, somewhere to the north of our campsite. "Where did everyone go?" it called, with the slightly worried tone that Sarah used when she was concerned about group safety during our hiking trips. "I can't find the tents." But Sarah was sitting right next to us, clearly as disturbed as Jake and I were by hearing her own voice calling from the darkness. The mimicry was perfect, not just the sound of her voice, but her characteristic phrasing and the emotional tone she used when she was genuinely concerned about something. "This is really freaking me out," Sarah whispered, moving closer to our small circle around the camp stove. "Whatever that is, it sounds exactly like me." Over the next hour, the voices continued sporadically. Sometimes it was Jake's voice, calling from various directions around our campsite, sometimes Sarah's, and occasionally what sounded like my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. The calls were always plausible things we might say while camping: requests to check on something, questions about equipment, or comments about the surroundings. What made the experience particularly unsettling was how accurately the voices captured not just our speech patterns, but our personalities and the kinds of things we typically said to each other. When Jake called about finding something interesting, it reflected his genuine enthusiasm for discovering new features in wilderness areas. When Sarah expressed concern about finding the tents, it matched her natural tendency to worry about group safety. We tried calling back to the voices, thinking that maybe we were somehow experiencing an acoustic phenomenon that was echoing or distorting our own speech. But when we shouted questions or challenges toward the source of the calls, there were no responses. The voices only spoke when we were sitting quietly, and they never engaged in any kind of interactive conversation. Around midnight, the mimicry became more sophisticated and more disturbing. We began hearing conversations between our voices, Jake and Sarah discussing plans for the next day's hike, Sarah and I talking about the weather forecast, Jake and I debating the best route back to the trailhead. But all three of us were sitting together around our camp, listening to what sounded like recordings of conversations we'd never actually had. The phantom conversations were eerily realistic, featuring topics we'd actually discussed earlier in the trip, but with details changed or expanded in ways that made them seem like alternative versions of our real interactions. It was as if something had been listening to us for days and was now experimenting with recombining our speech patterns into new conversations. "We need to leave," Sarah said after listening to a particularly detailed conversation between her voice and mine about hiking routes she was certain we'd never discussed. "Whatever's doing this has been watching us, learning how we talk. This isn't random mimicry. It's too accurate, too specific." Jake agreed, but pointed out that hiking in the dark through unfamiliar forest terrain would be dangerous, especially if something was actively trying to confuse or misdirect us using our own voices. We decided to stay put until dawn, keeping all three of us awake and close together to avoid any possibility of becoming separated or confused about who was actually speaking. The voices continued throughout the night, becoming more frequent and more complex as the hours passed. Sometimes we would hear all three of our voices engaged in animated conversations about topics ranging from work stress to childhood memories, delivered with perfect accuracy, but discussing things we'd never shared with each other. Most disturbing were the calls that seemed designed to separate us. Jake would call for help from one direction, while Sarah called from another, creating scenarios where our natural instinct would be to split up to respond to our friend's apparent distress. But we maintained our agreement to stay together, recognizing that the voices were attempting to isolate us, using our own instincts for mutual aid. As dawn approached, the vocal mimicry gradually decreased in frequency and complexity. The last calls we heard were simple repetitions of our names, spoken in our own voices, but with an emptiness that made them sound hollow and mechanical compared to the sophisticated conversations we'd been hearing throughout the night. When full daylight arrived, we broke camp immediately and began the hike back to the trailhead. During the 8-mile trek out, we discussed what we'd experienced and tried to develop rational explanations for the vocal mimicry. But none of us could account for the accuracy of the imitations or the sophisticated understanding of our speech patterns that whatever was in the forest had demonstrated. The hike out was uneventful, with no unusual sounds or signs that we were being followed or observed. But all three of us remained nervous and alert, calling out frequently to confirm that we were all present and that any voices we heard were actually coming from members of our group. I've researched acoustic phenomena that might explain what we experienced, looking for scientific accounts of sound reflection, atmospheric effects, or wildlife behavior that could produce accurate vocal mimicry. But I've found nothing that adequately explains the sophistication and interactivity of what we heard during that night beside the Alpine Lake. Some reports from other wilderness areas describe similar encounters with entities that can replicate human speech with extraordinary accuracy, using the voices of campers or hikers to create confusion and potentially dangerous situations. The accounts typically involve remote locations where people have been camping for several days, suggesting that whatever produces the mimicry requires time to observe and learn speech patterns. We've never returned to that particular area of the Olympic National Forest, and we've never encountered similar vocal mimicry during subsequent camping trips. But the experience changed how we approach wilderness camping, making us more aware that remote forest areas might be inhabited by entities capable of sophisticated observation and interaction with human visitors. Whatever called to us, using our own voices during that long night, was intelligent, patient, and clearly interested in understanding and manipulating human communication. It had observed us long enough to master not just our vocal patterns, but our personalities, our relationships, and our typical ways of interacting with each other during wilderness adventures. The forest that had seemed so peaceful and empty during our first 2 nights revealed itself to be inhabited by something that could listen, learn, and attempt to influence our behavior using our own voices as tools for creating confusion and separation. Somewhere in the old-growth wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, entities continue to observe human visitors, perfecting their ability to replicate our speech and potentially learning more about our behavior than we realize from the safety of our civilized assumptions about what shares the forest with us during our brief visits to their permanent domain. I installed the security camera after my neighbor's cabin was broken into last summer. It seemed like common sense. I spend most weekends at my place up in the Adirondacks, but during the week it sits empty, and there had been a string of break-ins throughout the region. The camera was nothing fancy, just a wireless model that sent alerts to my phone and stored footage in the cloud. I mounted it under the eaves above my front door, angled to capture anyone approaching the cabin. The property is about 2 hours north of Albany, 15 acres of mixed forest, with a small log cabin that my grandfather built in the 1960s. It's accessed by a quarter-mile dirt road that branches off from a county highway, and my nearest neighbor is almost a mile away through thick woods. During the week, especially in winter, it's about as isolated as you can get in upstate New York. I'd had the camera for about 3 months when I got the alert that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late February, and I was at my apartment in the city, settling in to watch a movie after a long day at work. My phone chimed with a motion detection notification from the cabin camera. I almost ignored it. I got false alarms, fairly regularly from deer wandering through the yard or branches swaying in the wind. But something made me open the app and check the live feed. The image showed the familiar view of my front porch and the snow-covered yard beyond, illuminated by the camera's infrared LEDs. Everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it the previous Sunday when I'd driven back to the city. I was about to close the app when I noticed the timestamp on the recorded event that had triggered the alert. The motion had been detected at exactly 3:33 a.m., and the recording was 12 minutes long. 12 minutes of sustained motion detection was unusual. Most of my false alarms lasted only a few seconds, as whatever had triggered the sensor moved out of frame. I clicked on the recording and settled back to watch what I assumed would be footage of a deer or maybe a raccoon investigating my porch. The first few minutes showed nothing but the empty yard and the dark windows of the cabin. The infrared imaging gave everything a ghostly, black and white appearance, but I'd grown accustomed to that from checking the camera periodically. Then, at about the 4-minute mark, a figure walked into frame from the left side of the screen. At first glance, it looked like a person. The figure was tall and moved upright on 2 legs, approaching the cabin from the directions of the tree line. But as I watched more carefully, I realized something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, maybe 7 feet or more, and its limbs seemed unusually long. It moved with an odd, gliding gait that didn't quite match normal human locomotion. The figure approached my front door and stopped directly in front of it, maybe 3 feet from the camera. This should have given me a clear view of whatever it was, but instead, the image became strangely unclear. The infrared illumination seemed to scatter or diffuse around the figure, creating a halo effect that obscured details. I could make out the general outline: tall, thin, humanoid, but facial features, clothing, even specific body details were lost in a kind of visual static. What disturbed me most was how still it stood. For the remaining 8 minutes of the recording, the figure didn't move at all. It simply stood there facing my door, motionless as a statue. There was something profoundly unnatural about that stillness. No shifting weight, no minor adjustments of posture, none of the unconscious movements that even the most disciplined person would make while standing in one place for that long. At the end of the 12-minute recording, the figure simply walked away, moving back toward the tree line with the same gliding motion it had arrived with. It disappeared from frame, and the motion detection stopped. I immediately checked the live feed, but the yard was empty again, showing no sign that anything had been there. I watched the recording 3 more times that night, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Maybe it was a very tall person in heavy winter clothing. Maybe the infrared imaging was creating visual artifacts. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But none of those explanations felt adequate. The figure's proportions were wrong, its behavior was wrong, and the way the camera seemed unable to capture clear details of it suggested something beyond normal technical limitations. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that tall, still figure standing at my door, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and reported a possible trespasser. I didn't mention the unusual aspects of the recording. I just said my security camera had captured someone on my property, and I was concerned about potential break-ins. Deputy Martinez was sympathetic, but not particularly surprised. He told me that isolated properties often attracted transients, especially during winter when people were looking for shelter. He said he'd have a patrol car drive by when possible, but with the cabin being so remote, regular patrols weren't practical. He suggested I consider additional security measures and promised to keep my report on file. I drove up to the cabin that weekend, partly to check on the property and partly because I needed to see the place where the recording had been made. Everything looked normal in daylight. No footprints in the snow, no signs of disturbance around the door or windows. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any indication that someone had been there, but the snow was unmarked except for animal tracks. I checked the camera's position and settings, wondering if there might be some technical explanation for the strange visual effects in the recording. But the camera was securely mounted and functioning normally. I even tested it by walking in front of it myself, and the infrared imaging captured my movements with perfect clarity. Whatever had caused the distortion around the figure in the recording, it wasn't a camera malfunction. That night, I stayed at the cabin with every light on and my grandfather's old hunting rifle within easy reach. I monitored the camera feed constantly on my phone, jumping at every shadow that moved across the screen. But the night passed quietly, and nothing appeared except a few deer browsing near the tree line around midnight. I thought that might be the end of it. Strange as the recording was, it was just one isolated incident, and there were probably rational explanations I hadn't considered. But 2 weeks later, I got another alert. This time, the motion detection triggered at 3:33 a.m. exactly, the same time as before. The recording was 12 minutes long, just like the first one, and when I opened the file, I saw the same tall figure approaching from the same direction, walking with that same unnatural glide, stopping in the same spot directly in front of my door. The visual distortion was even more pronounced in this second recording. The figure seemed to flicker and shift, as if the camera was having difficulty focusing on it. Sometimes it appeared solid and definite, sometimes it seemed translucent, almost ghostly. But throughout the 12 minutes, it maintained that same perfectly motionless stance, facing my door as if waiting for something. This pattern continued for the next 6 weeks. Every 2 weeks, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the motion detector would trigger. Every time, the recording would be exactly 12 minutes long. Every time, the same figure would appear, approach the door, stand motionless, and then walk away. The consistency was both fascinating and terrifying. Whatever this thing was, it was operating on a schedule, following some kind of routine that I couldn't begin to understand. I started researching everything I could find about unexplained sightings in the Adirondacks. The region has a long history of strange encounters, stories of unusual creatures in the deep woods, reports of figures that don't quite look human, tales passed down by loggers and hunters, and old-timers who've spent their lives in the mountains. Most of it was folklore and local legend, but the consistency of certain details across different accounts was unsettling. I also began to notice changes in my own behavior. I found myself obsessing over the camera feed, checking it constantly throughout the day and night. I stopped sleeping well, even when I was in the city, because I was always expecting another alert. The cabin which had been my refuge from urban stress, became a source of anxiety that I couldn't escape. The seventh recording was different. The figure appeared at the usual time and followed its usual routine, but when it reached the door, it turned to look directly at the camera. For the first time, I could see its face clearly through the infrared imaging, and what I saw made me understand that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The features were recognizably humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways that triggered every instinctual alarm I possessed. The eyes were too large and too dark, reflecting the infrared light with an intensity that created bright spots on the recording. The proportions of the face were stretched and elongated as if someone had taken human features and pulled them in directions they weren't meant to go. And when it looked at the camera, I had the unmistakable impression that it could see me watching it, that it was aware of my observation despite the hundreds of miles between us. It stood there for the full 12 minutes, staring directly into the camera lens, before turning and walking away as it always did. But this time, just before it disappeared from frame, it raised one impossibly long arm and appeared to wave goodbye. I never went back to the cabin after that. I put the property up for sale the following week, taking a significant loss just to be rid of it. The real estate agent asked why I was selling such a beautiful and peaceful retreat, and I told him I'd lost interest in camping. I never mentioned the recordings or the thing that visited my door every 2 weeks with clockwork precision. The new owners are a young couple from Massachusetts who wanted an escape from city life. I hope they're happy there. I hope they never install a security camera, and I hope that whatever was visiting my cabin was tied to me personally rather than to the place itself, because the thought of that tall, patient figure standing at their door in the small hours of the morning is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. I still have all the recordings saved on my phone. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself watching them again, trying to understand what that thing wanted from me. It never tried to break in, never caused any damage, never showed any signs of hostility. It just stood there, waiting, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was giving me time to figure out something important. But I never did figure it out, and now I never will. I live in a downtown apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and city lights and the constant hum of urban life. I tell myself I'm safer here, but sometimes, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I wake up with the feeling that something is standing just outside my door, patient and still and impossibly tall, waiting for me to understand what it's trying to tell me. I was flying from Phoenix to Seattle on what should have been a routine 2-hour flight, seated in 14A with my laptop open, working on a presentation for a Monday morning meeting. It was a clear Thursday evening in March, the kind of perfect flying weather that makes air travel feel almost boring in its predictability. I'd made this same trip dozens of times for work, and I barely looked up from my screen when the pilot announced we were beginning our descent into Seattle-Tacoma International. That's when I noticed we were flying over terrain that didn't look right for the approach to SeaTac. Instead of the familiar urban sprawl of the Puget Sound region, I was looking down at what appeared to be vast stretches of desert broken by geometric patterns that looked too regular to be natural formations. Perfect circles, straight lines extending for miles, and rectangular shapes that suggested massive construction projects in the middle of nowhere. I'd never seen anything like it during previous flights into Seattle. I checked my phone's GPS, but we were flying too high for it to get a reliable signal. The woman in the seat next to me was also looking out the window with a puzzled expression, and across the aisle, a man was taking photos of the landscape below with his phone camera. "This doesn't look like Washington State," the woman said quietly. I agreed, but before I could respond, the pilot's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that immediately got everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been rerouted due to temporary air traffic control restrictions in our original flight path. We're currently flying over a special use airspace area, and I need to ask that all passengers please close window shades and refrain from taking photographs until we've cleared this region. This is a federal requirement, and flight attendants will be coming through to ensure compliance." The pilot's tone was different from the usual professional calm. There was an undertone of tension that suggested this wasn't a routine rerouting. Flight attendants immediately began moving through the cabin, politely but firmly asking passengers to lower their window shades and put away cameras. When the man across the aisle protested that he was just taking pictures of scenery, the flight attendant's response was unusually stern. "Sir, photography is strictly prohibited over this airspace." I lowered my shade as requested, but not before taking one more look at the landscape below. What I saw in those final seconds was even more unusual than the geometric patterns I'd noticed earlier. There were structures down there, large white buildings, arranged in perfect grids, connected by roads that formed geometric patterns across the desert floor. Some of the buildings were enormous, hangar-sized structures that dwarfed anything I'd ever seen from commercial aircraft. The most unsettling detail was the complete absence of normal infrastructure. No towns, no highways leading to the facility, no power lines or communication towers. Whatever was down there existed in complete isolation, hidden in what appeared to be hundreds of square miles of empty desert. For the next 20 minutes, we flew with all window shades closed, the cabin filled with an unusual tension as passengers murmured quietly about what they'd seen. The flight attendants remained unusually vigilant, occasionally walking the aisles to ensure that shades stayed down and that no one was using electronic devices to record anything. When we were finally allowed to raise the shades, we were flying over familiar Pacific Northwest terrain, the forests and mountains that surround Seattle, the urban development that marks the approach to SeaTac. It was as if we'd somehow jumped from the desert southwest directly to Washington State, skipping over everything that should have been in between. After we landed, I tried to research our flight path using online tracking services. According to Flight Radar 24 and similar sites, our flight had followed a completely normal route from Phoenix to Seattle, with no detours or deviations from the standard flight plan. The tracking data showed a straight line from departure to arrival, with no indication that we'd flown over any unusual territory. But I knew what I'd seen, and judging by the conversations I overheard while waiting for baggage claim, other passengers had seen the same things. Several people were discussing the geometric patterns in the desert, the unusual buildings, and the pilot's strange announcement about restricted airspace. I tried to identify what we'd flown over by studying maps of military installations and restricted areas in the western United States. There are several well known sites: Area 51 in Nevada, White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, various testing facilities scattered across the desert states. But none of them matched the scale or configuration of what I'd observed from the aircraft. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with trying to understand what we'd been shown during that detour. I researched commercial flight paths, military airspace restrictions, and various conspiracy theories about secret government facilities. What I discovered was a pattern of similar incidents reported by other passengers on flights across the western United States. Online forums contained scattered accounts of commercial flights being rerouted over mysterious desert installations, always with the same pattern. Passengers were allowed to observe for a few minutes before being ordered to close window shades and stop taking photographs. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: geometric patterns, large white buildings, isolated facilities with no apparent connection to normal infrastructure. Most disturbing were the accounts from passengers who had attempted to photograph or video these facilities. Several reported that their electronic devices malfunctioned during the flights, with cameras failing to record or images becoming corrupted. Others said that airport security had approached them after landing and requested that they delete any photos taken during the flight. I tried to contact other passengers from my flight to compare notes about what we'd experienced. Using the airline's customer service system, I was able to reach a few people who had been on the same flight. Their accounts matched mine perfectly: the desert landscape, the geometric patterns, the unusual buildings, and the pilot's announcement about restricted airspace. But when I tried to follow up with these passengers a few weeks later, I discovered something unsettling. Several of them claimed to have no memory of any detour or unusual landscape during the flight. When I described what we'd seen together, they insisted that the flight had been completely routine, with no deviations from the normal Phoenix to Seattle route. One woman who had been sitting next to me and had clearly been disturbed by what she'd seen became hostile when I brought up the subject, accusing me of trying to involve her in some kind of conspiracy theory. A man who had been taking photographs and had argued with the flight attendant claimed that nothing unusual had happened during the flight and that I must be confusing him with someone else. It was as if their memories of the event had been selectively edited, leaving them with recollections of a normal, uneventful flight, while I retained clear memories of the detour and everything we'd observed during those 20 minutes over restricted airspace. I've made the same Phoenix to Seattle flight several times since then, always hoping to experience another detour that might provide additional clues about what we'd been shown. But every subsequent flight has followed the normal route, with no deviations, no mysterious announcements, and no glimpses of secret installations hidden in the desert. I've come to believe that what we experienced wasn't an accidental rerouting due to air traffic control restrictions. It was a deliberate exposure, a carefully orchestrated glimpse of facilities that exist beyond public knowledge or oversight. Perhaps it was a test of some kind, or a way of gradually acclimating the population to the existence of projects that operate outside normal governmental transparency. The fact that most passengers' memories of the event were apparently altered or suppressed suggests a level of capability that extends far beyond simple military secrecy. Whatever organization operates those desert facilities possesses technology that can selectively modify human memory, leaving only certain individuals with clear recollections of what they've witnessed. I don't know why I was allowed to retain my memories while others were not, but I suspect it wasn't random. Perhaps some people are chosen to remember, to serve as witnesses who can gradually spread awareness of these hidden projects through careful sharing of their experiences. Or perhaps the memory modification process isn't perfect, and a small percentage of observers inevitably slip through the cracks. The desert installations are still out there, still operating in complete secrecy, still occasionally revealing themselves to commercial airline passengers who find themselves flying over restricted airspace that officially doesn't exist. And somewhere in the bureaucracy that manages these exposures, decisions are being made about who gets to remember what they've seen and who has their memories carefully edited to preserve the illusion that such places exist only in the realm of speculation and conspiracy theory. I'll never know for certain what I was shown during those 20 minutes over the desert, but I know that it represented technology and organizational capability that exists far beyond anything we're supposed to be aware of. The question isn't whether secret projects operate in hidden facilities. It's how many of us have been shown evidence of their existence and then had our memories altered to protect secrets that are too important to remain completely hidden but too sensitive to be fully revealed. My dog Buster disappeared while I was cleaning out the crawl space under my house on a Saturday afternoon in March. He was a curious beagle mix who had a habit of following me wherever I went. So when I started organizing storage boxes in the narrow space beneath my 1940s ranch house, he naturally squeezed in after me to investigate what I was doing. The crawl space was typical for houses of that era, about 3 feet high, with a dirt floor and stone foundation walls that supported the wooden floor joists above. I'd been putting off dealing with the accumulated junk down there for months, but spring cleaning motivation had finally gotten me to tackle the project. Buster seemed to enjoy the adventure, sniffing around the perimeter and occasionally pawing at interesting scents he discovered in the dusty corners. I was sorting through boxes of old books when I heard Buster moving around behind me, his tags jingling as he explored areas where I'd already cleared away debris. The crawl space extended under most of the house, and I could track his movements by the sound of his feet padding across the dirt floor and his occasional snorts of investigation as he encountered new smells. After about 20 minutes of work, I realized I couldn't hear Buster anymore. The jingling of his collar tags had stopped, and there were no sounds of movement coming from anywhere in the crawl space. I called his name, expecting to hear him scrambling back toward me, but there was no response. I grabbed my flashlight and began searching the areas where I'd heard him exploring. The crawl space wasn't large, maybe 800 square feet total, and there weren't many places where a 40-pound dog could hide. But despite checking every corner and calling his name repeatedly, I couldn't find any trace of Buster. That's when I noticed something I'd never seen before in all the times I'd been under the house. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old water heater, there appeared to be an opening in the foundation wall. It was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and it led into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The opening looked like it had been deliberately constructed rather than created by settling or damage. The edges were smooth and finished, and the surrounding stonework showed signs of intentional modification. But I'd lived in the house for 5 years and had been in the crawl space numerous times without ever noticing this tunnel entrance. I called Buster's name into the opening, and this time I heard a response, a faint bark that seemed to come from deep within whatever space lay beyond the foundation wall. The sound echoed strangely, suggesting that the tunnel led to a much larger area than I would have expected under a residential property. I tried to squeeze into the opening to follow Buster, but it was too narrow for an adult human. I could get my head and shoulders through, but my chest wouldn't fit through the remaining space. From what I could see with my flashlight, the tunnel extended straight back for several feet before curving out of sight. Buster barked again, and this time the sound seemed to be coming from above me rather than from the tunnel. I backed out of the opening and listened carefully, trying to locate the source of his barking. The sound was definitely coming from somewhere above the crawl space, apparently from inside the house itself. I climbed out of the crawl space and went inside, calling Buster's name and listening for his barks. But the house was empty, and when I checked every room systematically, there was no sign of my dog anywhere. I could still hear him barking occasionally, but the sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if he were somehow inside the structure of the house. I returned to the crawl space and tried calling into the tunnel again. Buster responded immediately, but now his barks were clearly coming from above my head, somewhere within the floor joists and subflooring of the house. Somehow, the tunnel under the foundation had led him to a space that existed between the crawl space and the main floor, an area that shouldn't have existed according to the construction of the house. I spent the next hour trying different approaches to reach Buster. I removed several floorboards from inside the house, thinking I might be able to access whatever space he'd found, but I discovered only normal construction, floor joists, insulation, and electrical wiring. There was no evidence of any hollow space where a dog could be trapped. I called a contractor friend who had experience with older houses, thinking that maybe there was some aspect of 1940s construction that I didn't understand. When Bob arrived and I explained the situation, he was as puzzled as I was. He'd worked on dozens of houses from that era, and none of them had hidden spaces between the crawl space and the main floor. Bob helped me search both the crawl space and the house interior, but we couldn't find any explanation for where Buster's barks were coming from. The tunnel opening was still there, still extending into darkness that our flashlights couldn't adequately illuminate, but there was no accessible route from that tunnel to any space within the house structure. Maybe there's an old basement or root cellar that connects to your crawl space, Bob suggested. We researched the property records and found that the original lot had indeed contained a root cellar built in the 1920s before the current house was constructed. According to the building permits, the cellar should have been filled in and sealed when the foundation for the house was poured. But clearly, Some portion of it remained accessible through the tunnel we'd discovered. Bob brought specialized equipment the next day, a probe camera that could be fed into the tunnel to see where it led. What we found was a stone-lined chamber directly under the center of my house, maybe 8 feet square and 6 feet high. The space was empty except for Buster, who appeared healthy and alert, but unable to find his way back to the tunnel entrance. The camera revealed that the chamber had multiple tunnel entrances at different levels, creating a network of passages that extended beyond what we could see. Some of the tunnels led upward, which explained how Buster's barks could be heard from above the crawl space. The original root cellar had apparently been expanded over the decades, creating a complex underground system that existed entirely separate from the house's documented construction. We managed to rescue Buster by enlarging the tunnel opening enough for Bob to squeeze through and carry him back to the crawl space. The dog seemed none the worse for his underground adventure, though he showed no interest in returning to the crawl space area for several weeks afterward. But the discovery of the hidden chamber raised more questions than it answered. The stonework was clearly old, consistent with 1920s construction, but some of the tunnels showed signs of more recent modification. Someone had been maintaining and expanding the underground system long after the original root cellar should have been abandoned. We found evidence of electrical wiring in some of the passages, though it wasn't connected to my house's electrical system. There were also signs that the chambers had been used for storage, metal shelving brackets embedded in the walls, and anchor points that suggested heavy equipment had once been installed. I sealed the tunnel opening after Buster's rescue, using concrete blocks and mortar to prevent any future access to the underground system. But I occasionally hear sounds coming from beneath the house, footsteps, voices, and mechanical noises that suggest the hidden chambers are still being used by someone who has access through entrances I haven't discovered. The property survey shows only my house and yard, with no indication of underground structures or easements that would allow others to access the space beneath my home. But clearly, the tunnel system extends beyond my property boundaries, connecting to other areas in ways that aren't documented in any official records. Buster's disappearance revealed that my house sits above a hidden infrastructure that predates and underlies the residential development of the neighborhood. Someone built and maintains an underground network that serves purposes I can't identify, using spaces that exist parallel to but separate from the ordinary domestic life happening above ground. I've learned to live with the knowledge that there's another world directly beneath my feet, a network of tunnels and chambers where people move and work according to schedules and purposes that remain hidden from surface observation. Sometimes I wonder if other houses in the neighborhood sit above similar systems, if the entire residential area is really just a cover for underground activities that operate beyond normal municipal oversight. Buster never showed any interest in returning to the crawl space, but occasionally he'll stop in certain parts of the house and bark at the floor, as if he can hear sounds from below that my ears can't detect. He knows there's something down there, something active and ongoing that exists in the space between the mapped world above ground and the unmapped world that extends through tunnels and chambers that were never supposed to exist. I discovered it while scrolling through my photos on a Sunday morning, looking for a picture I'd taken of my niece's birthday cake the day before. The photo appeared between two images I remembered clearly, one of the cake with its 7 candles, another of my sister laughing as she helped blow them out. But there, nestled chronologically between those familiar moments, was a photograph I had never taken. It showed me sleeping. The image was taken from the foot of my bed, looking down at my sleeping form. I was lying on my side, one arm tucked under the pillow, my face peaceful in the way it only is during deep sleep. The lighting was soft, natural, as if taken during the early morning hours, when dawn light first begins to filter through bedroom curtains. The angle was slightly elevated, as if the photographer had been standing on something or holding the camera above their head. What disturbed me most wasn't just that someone had apparently entered my bedroom and photographed me without my knowledge, but that the image was stored in my phone's camera roll with a timestamp from 4:17 a.m. that very morning. According to the metadata, I had taken this picture myself, using my own phone, while I was unconscious. I live alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Portland. The front door has 2 deadbolts and a chain, and I'm meticulous about locking them every night before bed. The fire escape outside my bedroom window is accessible, but the window itself has been painted shut for years, and I would have heard anyone trying to force it open. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been in my apartment except me. I examined the photo more carefully, zooming in on details that might provide clues about how it had been taken. My bedroom was exactly as I remembered leaving it. Clothes draped over the chair in the corner, books stacked on the nightstand, the water glass I always kept within reach sitting in its usual spot. Nothing appeared to have been moved or disturbed. Even my phone, which should have been charging on the nightstand where I always left it, was visible in the image, plugged into the wall exactly where I expected it to be. But if my phone was on the nightstand charging, how could it have simultaneously been used to take a photograph from the foot of the bed? I checked the other photos in my camera roll, looking for any evidence of sleepwalking or unconscious activity, but the images before and after the mysterious bedroom shot were all normal. Pictures from my niece's party, a sunset I'd photographed on my evening walk, a recipe I'd captured from a cookbook. There was no sequence of bizarre middle-of-the-night photography, no other images that I couldn't remember taking. I called my sister, thinking perhaps I had mentioned sleepwalking or strange dreams during the birthday party, but she said I had seemed perfectly normal, tired perhaps, but coherent and present throughout the evening. When I described the photograph, trying to make it sound less alarming than it felt, she suggested I might have taken it accidentally, maybe while fumbling for my phone during the night. But I knew that explanation didn't make sense. The photo was too well composed, too deliberately framed to be an accident. Someone had stood at the foot of my bed, positioned the camera carefully, and taken a clear, focused image of me sleeping. The question was whether that someone had been me, acting in some unconscious state I couldn't remember, or whether it had been someone else entirely. I installed a motion-activated camera in my bedroom that night, positioning it to cover the area around my bed. If I was sleepwalking or engaging in activities I couldn't remember, I would have evidence. If someone else was entering my apartment, I would catch them in the act. I went to bed feeling somewhat reassured, though I found it difficult to fall asleep, knowing that I was being recorded. The next morning, I checked the camera footage eagerly. The recording showed me going to bed at my usual time, lying in the same position I'd seen in the mysterious photograph. But around 4:15 a.m., something strange happened. The camera's view suddenly shifted as if it had been moved or turned, and for several minutes it recorded only the ceiling. When the view returned to normal, I was still sleeping peacefully, and my phone was still charging on the nightstand. But when I checked my camera roll, there was another photograph. This one showed me from a different angle, taken from the side of the bed, capturing my profile against the pillow. The timestamp read 4:16 a.m., during the exact period when my security camera had mysteriously pointed toward the ceiling. I reviewed the security footage frame by frame, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance during the time the camera had been redirected, but there was nothing. No shadows crossing the lens, no indication that anyone had physically moved the device. It simply pointed upward for exactly 4 minutes, then returned to its original position, as if it had been programmed to look away during a specific window of time. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon continued with disturbing regularity. Every few nights, I would wake to find a new photograph of myself sleeping, each taken from a different position around my bed. The security camera would invariably malfunction during the exact moments when these pictures were being taken, always looking away or shutting off completely before resuming normal operation. I tried multiple cameras, different brands and models, even professional-grade security equipment borrowed from a friend who worked in private investigation. But every device I installed would experience the same mysterious malfunction, creating gaps in the recording that corresponded precisely with the appearance of new photographs in my camera roll. The pictures themselves became increasingly unsettling. While the first few had been taken from obvious positions around the bed, later images seemed to come from impossible angles, directly above me, as if taken from the ceiling or from beneath the bed looking upward. Some showed extreme close-ups of my face, so detailed I could see individual eyelashes, while others captured wide shots that included parts of the room that should have been outside the frame based on the apparent camera position. I consulted a sleep specialist, hoping to determine if I might be experiencing some form of parasomnia that could explain the nocturnal photography. The doctor conducted tests, monitored my sleep patterns, and reviewed my medical history, but found nothing unusual. My sleep cycles were normal. I showed no signs of sleepwalking or other unconscious behaviors, and I had no history of psychological conditions that might cause dissociative episodes. The doctor did note one curious finding. During the nights when the mysterious photographs appeared, my sleep was unusually deep and undisturbed. The brain waves recorded during those periods showed a level of rest that was almost unnaturally profound, as if something was ensuring that I would not wake up during the photography sessions. I began staying with friends and family members, thinking that changing locations might break whatever pattern was causing the phenomenon. But the photographs followed me wherever I went. A picture of me sleeping on my sister's couch, taken from her coffee table. An image of me in my parents' guest room, shot from the doorway. even a photograph of me napping in my car during a lunch break, captured from outside the passenger window. Each image appeared in my phone's camera roll with perfect clarity and appropriate timestamps, and each was accompanied by the same mysterious failure of any recording equipment I had set up to monitor my surroundings. Whatever was taking these pictures had developed an uncanny ability to avoid detection while documenting my most vulnerable moments. I started keeping my phone in a locked drawer before going to sleep, then progressed to leaving it in my car, then eventually storing it in a safe deposit box at the bank. But the photographs continued to appear, somehow transferred to my device, despite its physical absence from my sleeping area. The images now came with no metadata, no timestamp, no digital fingerprint that might explain how they had been captured or transmitted. The most disturbing discovery came when I decided to have the photographs analyzed by a digital forensics expert. She examined the images for signs of manipulation, looked for evidence of compositing or artificial generation, and analyzed every pixel for anomalies that might explain their origin. Her findings were both reassuring and terrifying. The photographs were completely authentic, showing no signs of digital manipulation or artificial creation. But according to her analysis, they hadn't been taken with my phone or any conventional camera. The image quality, compression artifacts, and digital signatures were unlike anything in her extensive database of camera and phone models. It's as if these pictures were created by something that understands photography perfectly, but doesn't use the same technology we do, she told me. The images are real, but they weren't captured by any device I can identify. I stopped trying to solve the mystery after that. The photographs continue to appear, roughly once or twice a week, showing me in various states of sleep across different locations and circumstances. I've learned to live with the knowledge that something, whether it's a part of my own unconscious mind or some external presence I can't comprehend, is documenting my rest with meticulous care and inexplicable method. The images have become a strange comfort in their consistency. They're never threatening or invasive beyond the basic violation of being photographed without consent. Instead, they seem almost protective, as if whatever is taking them wants to preserve moments of peace and vulnerability that I would otherwise never see. Sometimes I look through the collection, scrolling through months of sleep-in photographs like a bizarre family album. In them, I see myself at my most unguarded, free from the tensions and anxieties that mark my waking hours. The person in those pictures looks more peaceful than I feel most days, and I've begun to wonder if the photographs are less about surveillance than they are about showing me something I need to see about myself. I keep my phone on the nightstand now, accepting whatever process is responsible for these images. And sometimes, in the moments just before sleep, I wonder who will be watching through the lens tonight, and what they see in my sleeping face that compels them to preserve it forever, in pixels I'll discover come morning. My friend Alex and I have been recording a weekly podcast about local history from the spare bedroom I've converted into a home studio. It's nothing fancy, just a couple of decent microphones, some acoustic foam on the walls, and a digital recorder that captures our conversations about forgotten stories from our town's past. We've been doing this for about 2 years, and I've become familiar with the normal sounds that occasionally bleed into our recordings. Distant traffic, the neighbor's dog, the hum of the air conditioning cycling on and off. Last Tuesday evening, we were recording an episode about the old Riverside Theater that burned down in 1952, discussing what little information we'd been able to find about the fire and the people who had worked there. About 20 minutes into our conversation, Alex was describing the theater's final performance when we both heard a third voice join the discussion. It was a woman's voice, clear and distinct, speaking with the kind of precise diction that suggests someone from an earlier era. The fire wasn't an accident, the voice said, interrupting Alex mid-sentence. Margaret knew what was going to happen, but she couldn't stop it. Alex and I both stopped talking immediately, looking at each other with expressions of confusion and alarm. We were alone in the room. The door was closed, and there was no way for anyone else's voice to be picked up by our microphones unless they were speaking directly into them from close range. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered, pointing at the recording equipment, as if the voice might have come from the digital recorder itself. I nodded, checking to make sure our equipment was working normally. The recording levels were fine, both microphones were functioning properly, and there were no signs of technical malfunction that could explain the intrusion of an unknown voice into our conversation. We continued recording, both of us nervously discussing what we just heard while keeping an eye on the audio meters to see if the mysterious voice would return. But the rest of the session was normal, with only our two voices captured by the microphones and no further unexplained audio anomalies. When we reviewed the recording the next day, the woman's voice was clearly audible in the audio file. It wasn't a case of misheard words or audio pareidolia. There was definitely a third speaker who had joined our conversation with information about Margaret and the theater fire. The voice had its own distinct characteristics, slightly higher pitched than either of ours, with an accent that sounded like it belonged to someone from the 1940s or 1950s. What made the intrusion even more unsettling was that the mysterious voice had provided specific information that we hadn't known before. We'd never encountered anyone named Margaret in our research about the Riverside Theater, and we had no information suggesting that the fire had been anything other than an electrical accident, as reported in the local newspaper from 1952. Alex suggested that we might have somehow picked up a radio transmission or interference from another electronic device, but the voice was too clear and too specifically related to our conversation topic to be explained by random radio chatter. It had responded directly to our discussion, providing relevant information rather than unrelated content you'd expect from broadcast interference. I spent the next few days researching Margaret and the Riverside Theater fire, using the mysterious voice's comment as a starting point for deeper investigation. What I found in old city records and newspaper archives was disturbing and seemed to validate the information we'd received from our unknown third speaker. Margaret Ashworth had been the theater's assistant manager in 1952, and according to insurance investigator reports that weren't published in the newspaper, she had told investigators that she'd received anonymous warnings about fire safety problems in the weeks before the blaze occurred. She'd reported these concerns to the theater owner, but no action had been taken to address the electrical issues that eventually caused the fire. More interesting was a police report I found suggesting that Margaret had suspected the fire might have been deliberately set to collect insurance money. She'd told investigators that the theater owner had been facing serious financial difficulties and had recently increased the building's fire insurance coverage. But her suspicions were apparently dismissed, and the fire was officially ruled accidental. Margaret Ashworth had died in 1987, according to the obituary I found in the local newspaper archives. She'd lived in our town for her entire life, working at various businesses downtown until her retirement in the 1970s. There was no apparent connection between her and our podcast, no reason why her voice would somehow intrude into our recording equipment decades after her death. The following week, we decided to record our next episode about the Riverside Theater fire, incorporating the new information I discovered about Margaret's suspicions and the insurance investigation. We hoped that focusing on the topic might provide additional context for the mysterious voice, or possibly trigger another unexplained intrusion. About 15 minutes into the recording session, the same woman's voice returned, this time sounding more urgent and emotional. "They threatened me," she said, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested fear or anger. "Mr. Carlson said I'd lose my job if I kept asking questions about the wiring, but I knew someone was going to get hurt." Again, the voice provided specific information that we hadn't encountered in our research. We'd found no mention of anyone named Carlson in connection with the theater, and we had no information about threats or intimidation related to the fire safety concerns that Margaret had raised. This time, Alex had the presence of mind to speak directly to the voice. "Margaret, is that you?" he asked. "Can you tell us more about what happened at the theater?" But there was no response. The mysterious voice had delivered its message and then disappeared, leaving us with more questions and another research lead to pursue. The rest of our recording session was normal, with no further unexplained audio. My investigation into Mr. Carlson revealed that Robert Carlson had been the owner of the Riverside Theater in 1952, and that he had indeed filed a substantial insurance claim after the fire destroyed the building. What I found most interesting was that Carlson had left town within 6 months of collecting the insurance payout, selling his other local business interests, and relocating to California with no forwarding address. The insurance company's investigation file, which I was able to access through a Freedom of Information request, contained notes suggesting that the company had been suspicious of Carlson's claim but had been unable to prove fraud. Margaret Ashworth had been their primary source of information about potential safety violations and financial motives, but she had apparently stopped cooperating with the investigation after receiving what the notes described as pressure from local business interests. Over the following months, the mysterious voice appeared in 5 more of our podcast recordings, always providing historically accurate information that we were able to verify through subsequent research. Margaret's voice guided us to discover corruption, cover-ups, and hidden connections that revealed the Riverside Theater fire to be part of a larger pattern of insurance fraud that had occurred in our town during the early 1950s. Each time the voice appeared, it provided specific details that led us to archival materials we would never have found otherwise. Margaret seemed to be using our podcast as a way of finally telling the complete story about the fire and the circumstances that had prevented the truth from being revealed during her lifetime. The final intrusion from Margaret's voice came during our last recording about the theater fire. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice sounding peaceful and resolved. "The truth needed to be told, and you've given me the chance to finally say what I couldn't say when I was alive." We never heard from Margaret again, despite continuing to record episodes about other local history topics. Her voice had appeared only in connection with the Riverside Theater story, providing the missing pieces that allowed us to uncover the full truth about the fire and the corruption that had covered up its real cause. The experience changed how I think about the relationship between historical research and the people who lived through the events we study. Margaret's voice had reached across decades to provide information that existed nowhere in official records, using our recording equipment as a communication channel to ensure that her knowledge wouldn't be lost forever. Our podcast episodes about the Riverside Theater fire have become some of our most popular, partly because of the fascinating historical revelations, but also because of the mysterious way we obtained some of our information. We've been careful not to sensationalize Margaret's contributions, presenting them as part of our research process, while letting listeners draw their own conclusions about the source of our most intriguing discoveries. The recordings remain in our archives as evidence that historical truth sometimes finds ways of emerging, even when official records have been suppressed or destroyed. Margaret's voice served as a bridge between past and present, using our podcast to complete the historical record and ensure that the real story of the Riverside Theater fire would finally be preserved for future generations who might be interested in understanding what really happened during those tumultuous years in our town's hidden history. I've never told this story to anyone who didn't already know me well, because I know how it sounds. Even now, sitting here trying to put it into words, I can feel that familiar tightness in my chest. The same feeling I had that night when I kept checking the rearview mirror, hoping I wouldn't see what I knew would still be there. This happened in the winter of 2019 on a stretch of Highway 287 that cuts through the high desert between Amarillo and Denver. My wife Sarah and I were driving back from her sister's wedding in Texas, taking the northern route because we wanted to avoid the interstate traffic. It was late February, one of those clear, cold nights when the stars seem close enough to touch and the horizon stretches out forever in all directions. We'd left Amarillo around 9:30, planning to drive straight through to Denver. Sarah was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window, and I had the radio turned down low to some late-night talk show that was discussing conspiracy theories. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. At the time, I was only half listening, more focused on the hypnotic rhythm of the white lines disappearing under our headlights. The highway through that part of the country is lonely in a way that city people don't understand. For miles at a time, you might not see another car, another light, another sign that anyone else exists in the world. It's just you and the road and the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. Some people find it unsettling, but I'd always found it peaceful. There's something comforting about being a single point of light moving through all that emptiness. We were maybe 20 miles north of Dumas when I first noticed it in my peripheral vision, a light off to the east, roughly parallel to the highway. At first glance, it looked like it might be an airplane, bright white with just a hint of blue, moving at what seemed like a reasonable speed for aircraft. But something about it nagged at me. The light was too steady, too focused. Airplane lights blink, or at least vary in intensity, as they move through the sky. This one maintained the same brightness, the same color, the same perfectly round shape. I kept glancing over at it as I drove, trying to figure out what I was seeing. It stayed roughly the same distance from the highway, maybe a mile or two out across the prairie, and it seemed to be keeping pace with us. When I sped up slightly to test my theory, the light seemed to speed up as well. When I slowed down, it slowed down, but the changes were subtle enough that I told myself I was imagining things. Sarah stirred in her sleep and shifted position, and I looked away from the light for a few moments to make sure she was comfortable. When I looked back, the light was closer to the road, maybe half a mile out now, and it was definitely keeping pace with us. I could see it more clearly. It was perfectly spherical, about the size of a basketball if you held it at arm's length, and it cast no beam of light downward despite its brightness. It simply existed, a ball of clean, white light moving silently across the dark landscape. I considered waking Sarah, but she'd been dealing with morning sickness. She was about 3 months pregnant with our first child, and she needed the rest. Besides, I still wasn't entirely convinced that what I was seeing was anything more than an unusual aircraft, or maybe some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. I'd heard of ball lightning and similar things. Maybe this was something along those lines. But as the miles passed, it became harder to maintain that rational explanation. The light never wavered, never changed course, never showed any of the characteristics I would expect from a natural phenomenon. It simply stayed with us, matching our speed exactly, maintaining the same distance from the road. Sometimes it would drift a little closer, sometimes a little farther away, but it never disappeared behind hills or trees the way a ground-based light source would. After about 10 miles of this, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I turned off the radio and drove in silence, checking the speedometer obsessively. We were doing a steady 70 miles per hour, and the light was keeping perfect pace. No airplane flies that slowly. No helicopter could maintain that kind of steady flight pattern for that long without making any sound that I could hear. I tried the various tests. I would speed up to 80, then slow down to 60. The light adjusted accordingly every time. I would take my foot off the gas and let the car coast down hills, then accelerate up the other side. The light never fell behind or pulled ahead. It was as if we were connected by an invisible string, moving through the night together. The strangest part was how steady it remained. In my rearview mirror, I could see our own headlights bouncing slightly as we hit small bumps in the road, swaying gently as we took curves. But the light outside maintained perfect stability, as if it were following a road that was smoother than the one we were actually driving on. About 30 miles into this strange procession, we came to a small town, just a cluster of houses and a gas station around a crossroads. I thought about stopping, maybe waking Sarah and pointing out the light, maybe calling someone. But who would I call, and what would I say? As we passed through the town, I watched carefully to see if the light would behave differently, maybe seek out the populated area or react to the presence of other people, but it simply continued on its parallel course, ignoring the town completely. It was past midnight now, and the highway had become even lonelier. We hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The landscape was flat and featureless, broken only by the occasional ranch gate or irrigation canal. In that vast emptiness, the light seemed like the only other living thing for hundreds of miles. I started talking to it under my breath, which I realize sounds crazy. But the silence in the car was becoming oppressive, and I needed to hear something, even if it was just my own voice. I whispered. Of course, there was no answer, just the steady presence of that impossible light keeping us company through the darkness. Around 1:30, I noticed that the light was gradually moving closer to the highway. The change was so slow that I might not have noticed it if I hadn't been watching so intently, but over the course of several miles, it had definitely closed the distance. Now it was maybe a quarter mile from the road, close enough that I could see it was casting a very faint glow on the ground beneath it, though still no beam or cone of light. This was when I started to feel genuinely frightened. Up until that point, I had been curious, puzzled, even excited by the mystery of it. But as the light drew closer, some primitive part of my brain began sending alarm signals. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, checking the locks on the doors, glancing at Sarah to make sure she was still breathing normally. The light continued to close the distance, moving with the same deliberate patience it had shown all along. When it was maybe 100 yards from the highway, I could see that it was larger than I had initially thought. Not basketball-sized, but more like a small car, perfectly spherical and glowing with that clean, steady light. There was still no sound, no disturbance of the air, no sign that it was affecting the physical world around it in any way. I don't know what I would have done if it had come all the way to the road. Fortunately, I never had to find out. Just as the light seemed about to reach the highway, it stopped. For several miles, it maintained that position, maybe 50 yards from the pavement, keeping perfect pace with us, but coming no closer. I could see it clearly now in my peripheral vision, a bright sphere moving silently through the night. Then, without any warning or change in behavior, it simply rose straight up into the sky and disappeared. One moment it was there, solid and bright and undeniably real, and the next moment it was gone, leaving nothing but the vast darkness and the memory of something impossible. I drove in stunned silence for several more miles, checking the mirrors constantly, waiting for it to reappear. But the night remained empty. Eventually, Sarah woke up and asked how much farther we had to go. I told her we were making good time, and she went back to sleep. I never mentioned the light. We reached Denver around 6 in the morning, just as the sun was coming up over the eastern plains. In daylight, the whole experience seemed like something that might have been a dream, except that I was wide awake and could remember every detail with perfect clarity. I had been watching that light for over 40 miles, for more than an hour of driving. It had not been a hallucination or a trick of tired eyes. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching everything I could about unusual lights, atmospheric phenomena, military aircraft, anything that might explain what I had seen. I read about ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, temperature inversions, experimental aircraft, weather balloons. None of it fit. What I had seen was too controlled, too purposeful, too responsive to our movements to be any natural phenomenon I could find described in the literature. Sarah and I now have 2 children, and we've driven that stretch of highway several times since that night, always during the day. The landscape looks different in daylight, more ordinary, more explainable. It's hard to imagine anything mysterious happening in all that open space under the bright sun. But I remember what it felt like that night, driving through the darkness with something impossible keeping pace beside us. I still don't know what it was. I've considered every rational explanation I can think of, and none of them adequately account for what I experienced. Maybe it was some kind of experimental military technology. Maybe it was a natural phenomenon that science hasn't fully explained yet. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into any category we have names for. What I do know is that we are not alone out here, not in the way we think we are. There are things moving through the night that don't follow the rules we've built our understanding of the world around. They're not necessarily hostile or threatening. The light that followed us seemed more curious than anything else, like it was simply observing, trying to understand what we were and where we were going. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I find myself checking the mirrors more often than I need to, scanning the horizon for lights that move too steadily or follow too closely. I've never seen anything like it again, but I know it's out there somewhere, moving through the darkness, keeping its own mysterious pace through the vast emptiness of the night. I never used to pay much attention to the night sky until my divorce was finalized and I found myself living alone for the first time in 15 years. The house felt too quiet, too empty, so I started spending evenings on the roof of my garage, lying on an old sleeping bag and looking up at the stars. It was peaceful in a way that the inside of the house wasn't, and gradually it became my nightly routine: dinner, dishes, then up the ladder to spend an hour or two watching the slow rotation of constellations above my suburban neighborhood. I live in a small city in northern Colorado, far enough from Denver that light pollution isn't too bad, but close enough that you can still see the glow on the southern horizon. From my rooftop, I had a clear view in all directions: the Front Range Mountains to the west, rolling plains to the east, and overhead on clear nights, more stars than most people ever take the time to notice. I'd been doing this for about 3 months when I started to learn the sky well enough to notice when something was different. I could recognize the major constellations, track the movement of planets, and spot satellites as they traced their predictable paths from horizon to horizon. The night sky, I discovered, follows patterns as reliable as clockwork, and once you know what to expect, anything unusual stands out immediately. It was a Thursday evening in late September when I first saw the star that shouldn't have been there. I was lying on my back, hands behind my head, watching the constellation Cassiopeia rise in the northeast. I knew that part of the sky well: 5 bright stars forming a distinctive W shape, surrounded by fainter stars that I'd learned to recognize over the summer. But that night, there was an extra star, brighter than it should have been, positioned just to the left of the constellation's center. My first thought was that it might be a planet. Mars and Jupiter are often bright enough to be mistaken for unusually brilliant stars, and their positions change slowly over the course of weeks and months. But I'd been tracking the planets with a star chart app on my phone, and nothing was supposed to be in that location. I checked the app anyway, holding the phone up to compare the screen with the actual sky, but it showed no planets, no bright stars, nothing that could account for what I was seeing. The new star was steady and white, noticeably brighter than anything else in that part of the sky. It didn't twinkle the way stars usually do when seen through atmospheric turbulence, and it didn't move like a satellite or aircraft. It simply sat there among the familiar stars of Cassiopeia, as if it had always belonged there. I watched it for about 20 minutes, occasionally checking my phone to see if the astronomy app could identify it. But according to every digital star chart I could find, that part of the sky should have been empty except for stars too faint to see with the naked eye. I was starting to think I might be looking at some kind of rare astronomical phenomenon when the star blinked at me. It wasn't a quick flicker like an aircraft navigation light or the brief occlusion you might see when a satellite tumbles and reflects sunlight at different angles. This was a deliberate, unmistakable blink. The star dimmed to nothing, stayed dark for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to full brightness. Then it did it again and again. I sat up on the sleeping bag, staring at this impossible thing in the sky. Stars don't blink on command. They don't have internal light sources that can be turned on and off. They're massive fusion reactors millions of miles away, and their light reaches us as a steady stream that's been traveling through space for years. What I was seeing violated everything I understood about how the universe works. The blinking continued in a slow, steady rhythm. 2 seconds dark, 2 seconds bright, 2 seconds dark, 2 seconds bright. It was so regular, so obviously intentional, that I found myself holding my breath between each cycle. After about 10 blinks, the pattern changed. The star went dark for 4 seconds, then bright for 2, then dark for 4 again. Then it switched to rapid flashing, bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark, before returning to the original 2-second rhythm. I fumbled for my phone and started recording video, though I doubted the camera would be sensitive enough to capture what I was seeing. On the small screen, the star looked like just another point of light among many, and the blinking was barely visible. But with my naked eyes, it was unmistakable. A brilliant star turning itself on and off like a cosmic lighthouse. The display continued for another 15 minutes. Sometimes, the star would blink in simple patterns, sometimes in complex sequences that seemed to contain some kind of coded information. Occasionally, it would go dark for longer periods, and I would start to think the show was over, only to have it suddenly flare back to life with a new blinking pattern. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the blinking stopped. The star returned to its steady brightness and remained that way for the rest of the evening. I stayed on the roof until after midnight, waiting for it to do something else, but it behaved like a normal star for the remainder of the night. The next evening, I was back on the roof as soon as it got dark, looking for the mysterious star. It was there, in the same position relative to Cassiopeia, burning with the same steady white light. I watched it for over an hour, waiting for the blinking to resume, but nothing happened. It looked like an ordinary star, indistinguishable from the thousands of others scattered across the sky. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with that star. I researched variable stars, pulsars, and other astronomical phenomena that might explain periodic changes in brightness. I learned about binary star systems, where one star regularly passes in front of another, creating an eclipse effect. I read about stellar flares and novae and everything else that might cause a star to change its appearance over time. But none of it fit what I had observed. Variable stars change brightness over periods of hours, days, or years, not seconds. Pulsars flash incredibly rapidly, dozens or hundreds of times per second, not in the slow, deliberate patterns I had witnessed. And binary eclipses create gradual dimming and brightening, not the sharp on-off transitions I had seen. 3 weeks after the first incident, it happened again. Same star, same deliberate blinking, but with different patterns. This time, I was ready with a better camera, a digital SLR with a telephoto lens that I borrowed from a photographer friend. I managed to capture several minutes of video that clearly showed the star turning on and off, though the quality still wasn't good enough to make out fine details. I also tried something new. During one of the star's dark periods, I used a powerful LED flashlight to send my own blinking signal toward that part of the sky. 3 quick flashes, then 3 slow ones, then 3 quick again, the international SOS pattern. I felt ridiculous doing it, like a child flashing a toy at an airplane, but I was desperate to establish some kind of communication with whatever was responsible for this phenomenon. To my amazement, the star responded. After I finished my SOS sequence, it went through the same pattern: 3 quick blinks, 3 slow ones, 3 quick again. Then it resumed its previous blinking pattern, as if acknowledging my signal before continuing with its own agenda. I tried other patterns. 5 quick flashes. The star responded with 5 quick flashes, a sequence of long and short blinks that spelled out hello in Morse code. The star repeated it back perfectly. Whatever was controlling that light in the sky, it was intelligent, and it was paying attention to my attempts at communication. This continued for about an hour, the star and I exchanging simple signals like 2 ships passing in the night. I felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the realization that I was communicating with something that could somehow control the light from a star, something that existed on a scale I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, without any warning or final signal, the star went dark and didn't come back. Not just stopped blinking, it disappeared entirely. Where there had been a bright point of light among the stars of Cassiopeia, there was now empty space. I spent the rest of the night staring at that spot, hoping the star would reappear, but it never did. It hasn't returned since then, and it's been almost a year now. I still go up on the roof every clear night, scanning that part of the sky, watching for any sign of the mysterious star. I've learned more about astronomy in the past year than I ever thought I would, studying star charts and keeping detailed logs of everything I observe. But I've never seen anything like that blinking star again. I've shared the video footage with several astronomy professors at the local university, claiming I captured it while experimenting with night photography. They've offered various explanations: a satellite reflecting sunlight, an aircraft with unusual lighting, atmospheric effects that can make stars appear to flicker. But none of them can account for the deliberate patterns, the responses to my signals, or the fact that the star eventually disappeared entirely. Sometimes I wonder if I was chosen for that communication, if whatever intelligence was behind it specifically sought out someone who would be watching at the right time and place. Other times I think it was just random chance. I happened to be looking up when something vast and incomprehensible decided to announce its presence to our small corner of the universe. What haunts me most is the question of scale. If something could control the light from a star, if it could turn stellar radiation on and off like a light switch, what kind of technology would that require? What kind of intelligence would possess that capability? And if such beings exist, what were they trying to tell me during that brief exchange of signals? I still flash my LED light at the stars occasionally, usually when I'm feeling particularly lonely or when the silence of the night becomes overwhelming. I cycle through different patterns, SOS, simple counting sequences, even attempts at mathematical concepts that might be universal. But the stars remain stubbornly normal, burning with their ancient light, showing no sign that anyone is listening. Except sometimes, late at night when my eyes are tired and my imagination is running wild, I think I see subtle variations in starlight that might be responses to my signals. A star that seems to pulse just slightly out of rhythm with atmospheric turbulence. A brief dimming that lasts exactly the right amount of time to be intentional. But I can never be sure if I'm seeing real communication or just the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. The experience changed my relationship with the night sky permanently. I can no longer look up at the stars without wondering which ones might be listening, which ones might be watching, which ones might suddenly decide to blink back. The universe feels less empty now, but also more mysterious, filled with intelligences operating on scales so vast that our entire solar system might be nothing more than a minor detail in their cosmic perspective. I keep watching, though. Every clear night, I'm up on that roof, scanning the sky for any sign that I'm not alone in my observations. Because once you've seen a star deliberately blink at you, once you've engaged in conversation with something that can manipulate the light of distant suns, you never stop hoping it might happen again. I learned Morse code from my grandfather when I was 12, sitting in his cramped basement workshop while he fine-tuned the ancient Hallicrafters receiver he'd bought second-hand in 1962. The rhythm of dots and dashes became as familiar to me as breathing, and by the time I got my amateur radio license at 16, I could copy 20 words per minute without thinking about it. There's something pure about communicating in code, something that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only the essential message moving through the air at the speed of light. For 23 years, I operated stations in the KC-9WRS from the spare bedroom of my house in Wisconsin, sending and receiving signals to other operators around the world. I worked mostly on 20 meters during the day and 40 meters at night, when the ionosphere would carry my 5-watt signal thousands of miles to places I'd never seen. I kept detailed logs of every contact, noting call signs and locations and signal reports, building a careful record of conversations that lasted only minutes but connected me to people I would never meet. My specialty was what we called weak signal work, making contacts with stations that were barely audible above the background noise, pulling coherent messages out of static and interference through patience and careful listening. I had a particular talent for copying partial signals, filling in the gaps that atmospheric disturbance created in the transmission. Other operators would send me their difficult intercepts, asking me to decode messages that had been corrupted during their journey through the upper atmosphere. The signal that changed everything came on a Tuesday night in March, around 11:30. I was monitoring 142770 URS, listening to a digital mode called PSK31 that painted scrolling text across my computer screen as operators around the world exchanged brief messages. The frequency was quiet except for a few European stations working each other across the Atlantic, their signals riding the nighttime propagation path that carried radio waves halfway around the world. Then I heard my own call sign. It was faint, almost buried in static, but unmistakably directed at me. KC9WRS to KC9WRS. The format was correct, my call sign being called by my call sign, but the syntax was wrong. You don't call yourself on the radio. It's like answering your own telephone, a technical impossibility that made no sense within the established protocols of amateur radio. I turned up the volume and fine-tuned the receiver, thinking perhaps I had misheard the transmission. But there it was again, clearer this time. KC9WRS to KC9RS QSL. The last part was a request for acknowledgement, asking if I was receiving the signal. I sat staring at the radio for a long moment, trying to understand what I was hearing. Someone was using my call sign to contact me, which was not only against regulations, but practically impossible unless they were transmitting from my own station. I keyed the microphone and responded, "This is KC and WRS. You are using my call sign. Please identify yourself properly." I released the transmit key and waited, listening to the soft hiss of background noise, while I tried to think of a rational explanation for what was happening. The response came immediately. KC now WRS day KC WRS. This is your transmission from October 15th at 23:47 UTC. Message follows. The weather here is clear and cold. Temperature 32 degrees. Light snow expected tomorrow. QRT. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. October 15th was 5 months away, and the message, I knew it word for word because I had transmitted those exact sentences during a routine weather report to a station in Minnesota 3 weeks earlier. But now, somehow, my own transmission was being played back to me by someone claiming to be me, dated in the future. I checked my logbook to be certain. March 8th, 23:20 UTC, I had indeed sent that weather report to WB9XYZ in Duluth. The words were identical, down to the specific temperature and the mention of expected snow. But according to the signal I was receiving, this transmission was somehow being sent from October 15th of the same year. I tried to respond, but the signal had faded, leaving only the normal background noise of the 20-meter band. I stayed at the radio for another 2 hours, listening and calling, but heard nothing more. I made a careful entry in my logbook, noting the impossible contact and the exact frequencies and times involved. Over the next several days, I researched every possible explanation I could think of. Radio waves can travel unusual paths under certain atmospheric conditions, bouncing off layers of the ionosphere in ways that extend their range far beyond normal limits. Occasionally, signals can even be reflected off the moon or artificial satellites, creating delayed echoes that return to Earth minutes or hours after transmission, but nothing I found could account for a signal being received 5 months before it was supposedly sent, or for the apparent editing of its content. The transmissions continued sporadically over the following weeks, always late at night, always using my call sign to contact me. Each time, I would hear portions of my own previous communications played back to me, but with subtle modifications. A weather report I had sent to California was repeated with a different temperature. A technical discussion I had conducted with a station in Germany came back with one word changed. A casual conversation about my day job was returned with my workplace, altered from school to hospital. The changes were small but significant, as if someone or something was testing my attention to detail, seeing if I would notice the discrepancies. I began keeping separate logs of the modified transmissions, documenting every variation from the original messages. The pattern was consistent, my own words, spoken in my own voice, but subtly wrong in ways that made me question my memory of the original conversations. I tried to engage with whoever was sending these signals, asking direct questions about their identity and location, but the responses, when they came, were always more of my own transmissions played back with minor edits. It was like talking to an echo that had learned to change its message slightly before returning to me. In May, I received the most disturbing transmission yet. It was a conversation I had never had, supposedly sent by me to a station I had never contacted. The voice was mine, unmistakably, but the words were unfamiliar. KC9WRS de KC9WRS. I understand now what's happening. The signals don't travel through space. They travel through time. Every transmission we send is also received somewhere else. Someone else. QRT. I played the recording back dozens of times, analyzing every syllable. The rhythm of the Morse code was identical to my own sending style, the particular spacing and timing that every operator develops like a fingerprint. But I had no memory of ever transmitting those words, and the implications of the message sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. 23 years of late-night radio operation, of sitting alone in the dark, listening to voices from around the world, might have taken a toll I hadn't recognized. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and the isolation of amateur radio can foster delusions of connection with people who might not even exist. But the recordings were real, captured on my digital interface and stored on my computer's hard drive. In June, I decided to conduct an experiment. I transmitted a specific message at exactly midnight UTC, something distinctive that I had never said before. This is KC9WRS testing temporal propagation. If anyone receives this transmission in the past or future, please respond with your location in time. I repeated the message several times and then settled back to wait. 3 hours later, I received my own transmission back. This is KC9WRS testing temporal propagation. If anyone receives this transmission in the past or future, please respond with your location in time. Response on October 15th, 2023. The experiment worked. The date was 4 months in the future from when I sent the original message, and there was no way I could have transmitted the response because I had been listening continuously since the original transmission. Yet there it was, my own voice answering my own question with information I couldn't possibly have had. I stopped transmitting after that. I continued to monitor the frequencies. listening for any further evidence of temporal propagation or edited signals, but I no longer keyed the microphone. If my transmissions were somehow traveling through time and returning changed, I didn't want to risk sending any more messages that might come back to haunt me. The last transmission came in September, just as I was beginning to think the phenomenon had ended. It was the longest message yet and the most coherent. KCNWRS to KCNWRS. This is your final transmission from December 31st, 1999. I want you to know that every signal we send changes things, creates ripples in time that we can't predict or control. The person editing your messages is you, 10 years in the future, trying to warn yourself about what's coming. Stop transmitting. Disconnect the antenna. Some conversations are too dangerous to have. 73. I looked up the date in my logbook. December 31st, 1999 was indeed my final transmission, for I went silent for several years, dealing with a family crisis that had required all my attention. The operator sign-off, 73, was correct, and the warning about future consequences felt genuine in a way I couldn't explain. I disconnected my antenna that night and put the radio equipment in storage. I told myself it was temporary, that I would return to the hobby once I had time to research what had been happening and understand the implications. But the boxes remained sealed, and my amateur radio license eventually expired from disuse. It's been 15 years since I last transmitted, but I still have the recordings of those impossible signals. I've had them analyzed by audio experts who confirm that the voice patterns match my own speech characteristics, but who can offer no explanation for how conversations I never had could have been recorded in my own voice. The technical parameters are all correct: frequency, modulation, signal strength, but the temporal displacement remains inexplicable. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should set up the radio again, just to listen. But I remember the warning that claimed to come from my future self, and I think about the responsibilities that come with every transmission. If our signals really do travel through time as well as space, if every message we send creates changes we can't foresee, then perhaps some frequencies are better left silent. And sometimes I wonder about the operator who edited my messages, the future version of myself who tried to warn me about the dangers of temporal communication. Did he succeed in changing the timeline, or are we still caught in a loop of messages and responses that echo backward and forward through years we haven't lived yet? I suppose I'll find out on October 15th, when the calendar catches up to the date that appeared so often in my impossible logbook entries. Until then, I keep my radio silent and my antennas disconnected, listening instead to the ordinary sounds of the present moment, trying not to think too much about the voices that might be calling my name from frequencies I can no longer bear to monitor. My grandfather left me very little when he died, just some old tools, a collection of books about astronomy, and a pocket watch that seemed completely unremarkable except for the fact that it had stopped working decades ago. The watch was a 1952 Hamilton Railway Special, the kind that railroad workers used to carry for precise timekeeping, but according to my grandmother, it had been broken since sometime in the 1970s and wasn't worth the cost of repair. I almost sold it to an antique dealer along with the other estate items, but something about its weight and craftsmanship made me decide to keep it as a memento. Grandpa had been a lifelong amateur astronomer, spending clear nights in his backyard with a telescope, documenting celestial events in detailed journals that filled an entire bookshelf. The watch seemed like the kind of precise instrument that would appeal to someone who tracked planetary movements and calculated eclipse timings. For 6 months, the watch sat in my desk drawer, a beautiful but non-functional reminder of my grandfather's methodical approach to observing the night sky. I'd take it out occasionally to admire the clean lines of its face and the intricate mechanical movement visible through the crystal caseback, but the hands remained frozen at 11:47, and the mechanism showed no signs of life despite my attempts to wind it. That changed on the night of December 13th, during the peak of the Geminids meteor shower. I'd driven out to a dark sky site about an hour from the city to watch the meteors, partly out of genuine interest and partly to honor my grandfather's memory by continuing his tradition of celestial observation. I was lying on a blanket in the bed of my pickup truck, watching brilliant streaks of light cross the star-filled sky when I felt the watch vibrating in my jacket pocket. When I pulled it out, the hands were moving, not just ticking in normal seconds, but sweeping smoothly around the dial as if the watch were rapidly adjusting to the correct time. Within 30 seconds, it had settled into normal operation, keeping perfect time and ticking with the steady rhythm of a precision timepiece. I assumed that the vibration from my truck's engine or some other mechanical disturbance had somehow jarred the mechanism back to life. Old watches sometimes start working again after years of inactivity, especially if they've been stored in stable conditions and only needed a shock to overcome sticky lubricants or settled components. But when I returned home that night, the watch stopped again. At exactly 11:47, the same time it had shown for months, the hands ceased moving, and no amount of winding or gentle tapping could restart the mechanism. By morning, it was as lifeless as it had been before the meteor shower. I researched the connection between mechanical watches and meteor showers, thinking that perhaps electromagnetic effects from space debris could influence precision instruments. But I found no scientific literature suggesting that meteor activity could affect timepiece mechanisms, and the idea seemed far-fetched even by the standards of unusual electromagnetic phenomena. 3 weeks later, during the Quadrantids meteor shower in early January, I decided to test whether the watch's operation had been coincidental or somehow related to celestial events. I drove to the same dark sky location, brought the watch with me, and waited to see if it would start working again during peak meteor activity. Around 2 a.m., when meteors were appearing at their most frequent rate, the watch began ticking again. This time, I was holding it in my hand and could feel the mechanism engaging, starting from complete stillness and building to steady operation within seconds. The hands moved to show the correct time, and the watch kept perfect time for the duration of my meteor observation session. When the meteor activity began to diminish around dawn, the watch gradually slowed and stopped again, returning to its frozen state at 11:47. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. The watch operated only during periods of significant meteor activity and ceased functioning when the celestial display ended. Over the following year, I tested the watch during every major meteor shower visible from my location. The Ete Aquariids in May, the Perseids in August, the Orionids in October, the Leonids in November. Each time, the watch would spring to life during peak viewing hours and stop when meteor activity declined. What made the phenomenon even more intriguing was the precision of the correlation. The watch didn't respond to sporadic meteors or minor showers that produced only a few meteors per hour. It operated only during significant meteor events that generated at least 15 to 20 meteors per hour, and its activity level seemed to correspond directly to the intensity of the celestial display. During particularly spectacular meteor showers, the watch would not only keep time, but would also exhibit additional behaviors that suggested it was somehow responding to the cosmic activity above. The second hand would occasionally pause for exactly the duration of especially bright fireballs, as if it were marking the passage of meteors that were particularly significant. I started bringing the watch to astronomy club meetings and star parties, sharing the story with other amateur astronomers who were familiar with my grandfather's work. Most people were skeptical, assuming that I was either mistaken about the correlation or that the watch had some mechanical problem that caused intermittent operation. But Dr. Sarah Martinez, a physics professor who specialized in atmospheric phenomena, was intrigued enough to examine the watch during a Perseid observation session. She confirmed that the timepiece operated normally during meteor activity and stopped completely when the shower ended, but she had no explanation for the mechanism that could cause such behavior. There's no known interaction between meteor activity and mechanical timepieces, she told me after studying the watch's behavior. Meteors are essentially space debris burning up in the upper atmosphere. They don't generate electromagnetic fields or other effects that should influence precision mechanical instruments. I researched my grandfather's astronomical journals, looking for any mention of the watch or unusual observations that might explain its behavior. What I found was a series of entries describing his discovery of the watch's unique properties during a Leonid shower in 1973. According to his notes, Grandpa had purchased the watch at an estate sale where it was described as having belonged to a railroad astronomer who had worked for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad in the early 1900s. The previous owner had reportedly used the watch to time celestial events, but the estate sale documentation provided no details about why a railroad timepiece would be useful for astronomical observations. Grandpa's journals described decades of testing the watch during meteor showers, documenting its precise correlation with celestial activity and his unsuccessful attempts to understand the mechanism that caused its unusual behavior. He'd consulted with watchmakers, physicists, and other astronomers, but no one could explain how a mechanical timepiece could be sensitive to meteor shower activity. The most intriguing entry was from 1979, when Grandpa wrote about noticing that the watch seemed to anticipate meteor activity by a few minutes, beginning to tick before meteors became visible and continuing to operate slightly longer than the observed shower duration. He speculated that the watch might be responding to cosmic phenomena that preceded or accompanied meteor displays but weren't visible to ground-based observers. I started paying closer attention to the watch's timing during meteor showers, and Grandpa's observations proved accurate. The watch would typically begin operating 5 to 10 minutes before I could see meteors with the naked eye, and it would continue running for several minutes after meteor activity had apparently ended. This anticipatory behavior suggested that the watch was responding to something more fundamental than the visible light trails that meteors create as they burn up in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was sensitive to changes in atmospheric electrical activity, cosmic radiation levels, or other phenomena that accompanied but weren't limited to the visible aspects of meteor showers. The watch has become my constant companion during astronomical observations, serving as both a timepiece and an indicator of cosmic activity that I might otherwise miss. Its unique sensitivity has helped me identify minor meteor showers that would have escaped my notice and has provided timing information that's proven useful for documenting celestial events. I've never found another timepiece with similar properties, despite researching the history of astronomical instruments and consulting with collectors of antique scientific equipment. The watch appears to be unique, a precision instrument that somehow acquired the ability to respond to cosmic phenomena in ways that conventional science can't explain. Whether the watch's sensitivity results from some modification made by its original owner, unusual materials used in its construction, or some other factor that affects its mechanical operation, it continues to mark time only when the Earth passes through streams of cosmic debris that create the spectacular light shows we call meteor showers. The watch keeps my grandfather's memory alive during every celestial observation, ticking steadily through meteor displays while remaining silent during ordinary nights when the sky shows only stars and planets. It's a reminder that precision instruments sometimes develop capabilities that extend beyond their intended functions, becoming sensitive to phenomena that connect us to the cosmic environment that surrounds our planet. When meteors streak across the dark sky, my grandfather's watch marks their passage with mechanical precision, keeping time for events that began millions of years ago when comets shed the debris that eventually intersects Earth's orbit and creates the celestial displays that have fascinated humans for millennia. In those moments, the watch serves as a bridge between human timekeeping and cosmic time, measuring minutes and hours that are meaningful only in the context of our planet's journey through space, filled with the ancient remnants of solar system formation. I was sitting on the dock at my uncle's cabin when I first heard the humming. It was late June, that perfect time of year when the northern Minnesota lakes are warm enough for swimming, but the mosquitoes haven't yet reached their summer fury. I'd come up for a week of solitude after my divorce was finalized, needing the kind of silence that only comes from being completely alone in a place where your cell phone has no signal and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away through dense forest. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of Loon Lake, a body of water so remote that it doesn't appear on most maps. My uncle built the place in the 1970s, back when you could still buy undeveloped lakefront for the price of a decent used car. It's a simple structure: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with windows that face west toward the water. The dock extends maybe 20 feet into the lake, ending where the sandy bottom drops off into the kind of deep, dark water that seems to hold secrets. I'd been there for 3 days, falling into the rhythm of lake life. Coffee at sunrise, reading in the afternoon, simple dinners cooked on the propane stove, while watching the sun set behind the trees on the far shore. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a beaver somewhere in the distance. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to remember who I was when stripped of all the complications that had accumulated over 15 years of marriage. The humming started around 9 in the evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky. I was sitting on the end of the dock with a cup of tea, watching the first stars appear in the clear northern sky, when I became aware of a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low, barely audible, like the distant drone of a large engine or the resonance of a tuning fork struck far away. But there was something musical about it, a quality that suggested intention rather than mechanical accident. At first, I thought it might be a boat somewhere on the lake, though I hadn't seen any other vessels during my 3 days there. The sound was too steady and too pure to be an outboard motor, but lakes can carry sounds in strange ways, and distance can transform the familiar into the mysterious. I stood up and scanned the water, looking for navigation lights or the wake of a passing craft. But the lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror. The humming continued for perhaps 10 minutes, neither growing louder nor fading away, maintaining the same gentle intensity throughout. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, there was something soothing about it, like a lullaby hummed by a voice too distant to identify. But as I listened more carefully, I began to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the water at all. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw it then, suspended about 50 feet above the center of the lake. At first, it was just a shape against the stars, darker than the sky around it, roughly circular and perhaps 30 feet in diameter. It hung motionless in the air, defying every law of physics I understood, making no sound except for that low, musical humming that seemed to emanate from its very structure. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, certain that fatigue or stress was causing me to see things that weren't there. But the object remained, solid and undeniable, a presence that transformed the familiar lake into something alien and strange. It wasn't a balloon or a helicopter or any kind of aircraft I could identify. It simply existed in the space above the water, patient and silent except for that continuous, gentle song. The humming had a rhythm to it, I realized, a subtle pulse that might have been synchronized with my heartbeat, or might have been causing my heart to synchronize with it. See, I couldn't tell which. There was something hypnotic about the sound, something that made it difficult to look away from the floating object or to think clearly about what I was witnessing. I felt calm in a way that didn't match the strangeness of the situation, as if the humming was designed to soothe observers rather than alarm them. I sat back down on the dock, deciding that I would simply watch and wait to see what happened next. The rational part of my mind was insisting that I go inside, call someone, document what I was seeing, but a larger part of me was content to remain still and observe. The object wasn't threatening. It made no aggressive movements, emitted no harsh lights, showed no interest in me at all. It simply hovered above the lake, humming its quiet song to the night sky. As my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, I began to see more details. The object's surface seemed to ripple slightly, like water or liquid metal, and there were patterns visible on its underside, geometric shapes that might have been panels or seams or something else entirely. The humming grew more complex as I listened, revealing harmonies and overtones that suggested multiple voices or instruments working together in perfect synchronization. I lost track of time sitting there. The object remained motionless while the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of hours I barely noticed. The humming continued without variation, that same gentle, hypnotic tone that seemed to resonate not just in my ears but in my chest, my bones, the wooden planks of the dock beneath me. I felt more peaceful than I had in months, as if the sound was washing away the accumulated stress and sadness of the past year. Sometime after midnight, the object began to move, not quickly or dramatically, but with the same deliberate grace it had shown while hovering. It drifted slowly eastward, staying at the same height above the water, the humming gradually fading as it moved away from me. I watched until it disappeared beyond the tree line on the far shore, leaving only the familiar sounds of the night. Wind in the pines, the gentle lap of water against the dock, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the forest. I sat there for another hour, waiting to see if it would return, but the lake had returned to normal. The stars reflected peacefully on the dark water, and the only movement was the occasional ripple caused by a fish surfacing or a beaver swimming across the shallow bay near the cabin. Eventually, I went inside and tried to sleep, but my dreams were filled with that humming sound, as if it had taken up residence somewhere deep in my memory. The next morning, I walked around the lake, looking for any physical evidence of what I had witnessed. I found nothing, no disturbed vegetation, no unusual marks on the ground, no debris that might have fallen from the floating object. The lake and the surrounding forest appeared exactly as they had before, pristine and undisturbed. I began to wonder if I had dreamed the entire experience, if the isolation and emotional exhaustion of the divorce had caused me to hallucinate something that had never been there at all. But that evening, around the same time, I heard the humming again. I was inside the cabin, washing dinner dishes, when the sound drifted through the open windows. I stepped onto the porch and saw the object in the same position as the night before, hovering motionless above the center of the lake. This time, I was prepared. I tried to take photographs with my camera, but every image came out as nothing more than dark sky and water, as if the object was invisible to electronic sensors. I spent the rest of my week at the cabin, documenting the phenomenon as carefully as I could. The object appeared every night at almost exactly the same time, remaining in position for 2 to 3 hours before drifting away toward the east. The humming was always identical, that same low musical tone with its complex harmonies and subtle rhythms. I recorded it on my phone, but when I played back the audio, I heard only the normal sounds of a quiet evening by the lake. On my last night, I decided to try communicating with whatever was controlling the object. I brought a flashlight to the dock, and when the humming began, I flashed a simple pattern: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, Morse code for SOS, the universal distress signal. I repeated it several times, pointing the beam directly at the floating form above the water. For a moment, nothing changed. Then gradually, the humming shifted to a different tone, higher and more complex than before. The pattern of the sound seemed to mirror the rhythm of my flashlight signal: 3 short pulses, 3 longer ones, 3 short again. But where my signal had been desperate and crude, the response was elegant and musical, as if my simple message had been transformed into something beautiful. I tried other patterns, long flashes, short bursts, random sequences, and each time the humming would shift to reflect what I had sent, interpreting my clumsy light signals as music and returning them as song. We continued this exchange for nearly an hour, and by the end, I felt like I had participated in a conversation conducted entirely in light and sound, meaning and emotion transcending the barrier of language. When the object finally drifted away that last night, the humming faded with a series of tones that sounded unmistakably like a farewell. I flashed my light 3 times in response and watched until the shape disappeared beyond the trees, leaving me alone with the sudden understanding that I had been changed by what I had witnessed. I returned to the city the next day, but I've never been able to forget those nights by the lake. I've researched every possible explanation: experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, mass hallucination, but nothing comes close to accounting for what I experienced. The object's behavior was too deliberate, too responsive, too purposeful to be explained by natural causes or human technology. I've been back to the lake several times since then, always hoping to see the humming object again. Sometimes I think I hear faint echoes of that musical tone carried on the wind, and once I could have sworn I saw a dark shape moving slowly across the stars. But I've never again witnessed anything as clear and undeniable as those 5 nights in June when something impossible floated above the water and sang to me in a language I didn't understand but somehow comprehended perfectly. I keep the experience to myself mostly. People would think I was crazy, or attention-seeking, or suffering from some kind of delayed stress reaction to my divorce. But sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly isolated or disconnected from the world, I remember the gentle humming that seemed to resonate in harmony with my own heartbeat. And I know that somewhere above the dark water of a remote lake, there are things that exist beyond our understanding, patient and musical and utterly alien, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to those who need to know that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. I was on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Chicago, sitting in seat 12A, a window seat that I'd specifically requested because I enjoy watching the landscape pass below during night flights. It was a Tuesday in late November, and the plane was only about half full, which meant I had the entire row to myself. I'd been reading for the first hour of the flight, but eventually dozed off as we reached cruising altitude, somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like gentle tapping on the airplane window beside my seat. Still half asleep, I assumed it was just the normal sounds of air turbulence or thermal expansion affecting the aircraft structure. Commercial planes make all sorts of small noises during flight, and I'd learned to sleep through most of them during years of frequent business travel. But the tapping continued with a rhythm that was too regular to be random mechanical noise. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more knocks. It was the kind of deliberate pattern that suggested someone was trying to get attention, which was obviously impossible at 30,000 feet above the Colorado wilderness. I turned to look out the window, expecting to see nothing but darkness and maybe the lights of distant towns far below. Instead, I found myself looking at something that shouldn't have been there, a dark shape silhouetted against the starlit sky, keeping pace with the aircraft just outside my window. At first, I thought it might be another airplane flying in formation with us, though I couldn't understand why any aircraft would be positioned so close to a commercial flight. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside, I could see that whatever was out there wasn't any kind of conventional aircraft. The shape was roughly humanoid, but larger than any person, with long limbs that seemed to be moving in a swimming motion through the thin air at cruising altitude. It appeared to be about 10 feet from the aircraft, maintaining perfect position relative to the plane despite the 500 mile per hour speed we were traveling. Most disturbing was that the figure seemed to be looking directly at me through the window. I couldn't make out facial features in the darkness, but there was a clear sense of focused attention, as if whatever was out there was deliberately trying to make contact with someone inside the aircraft. The tapping resumed, this time more insistent. The figure appeared to be using something like a hand or appendage to knock on the exterior of the window, creating sounds that were clearly audible inside the pressurized cabin. Tap, 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 the same three-knock pattern, repeated with mechanical persistence. I looked around to see if any other passengers had noticed the unusual sounds or the presence outside the aircraft. But the cabin was dark and quiet, with most people sleeping, and the few who were awake absorbed in books or electronic devices. The flight attendants were nowhere to be seen, probably resting in their crew areas during the long overnight flight. I considered pressing the call button to alert the crew, but what would I tell them? That something was tapping on the airplane window at 30,000 feet? That there was a humanoid figure flying alongside the aircraft without any visible means of propulsion? It sounded like the kind of report that would result in serious questions about my mental state rather than any investigation of what I was observing. The figure remained in position for what felt like 20 minutes, occasionally tapping on the window and seeming to examine the aircraft with the kind of systematic attention that suggested scientific curiosity. Its movements were fluid and controlled, showing no signs of distress from the extreme altitude, sub-zero temperatures, or lack of breathable atmosphere that would be fatal to any normal biological entity. At one point, the figure moved closer to the window, and I could see more details of its form. It appeared to be wearing some kind of form-fitting suit or covering that reflected light in ways that suggested advanced materials. The proportions were clearly not human, the limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the head too large for any terrestrial physiology. Most unsettling was when the figure pressed what appeared to be a hand against the window glass, spreading elongated fingers that had too many joints to be human. The appendage remained pressed against the window for several seconds, as if the entity were trying to make physical contact through the barrier that separated us. I found myself pressing my own hand against the interior surface of the window, matching the position of the entity's appendage on the other side of the glass. For a moment, we remained like that, separated by a few inches of aircraft window, but somehow connected across the impossible environment of high-altitude flight. Then the figure began to move away from the aircraft, not falling behind as you'd expect if it had lost its ability to match our speed, but deliberately ascending and accelerating until it disappeared into the darkness above. The tapping stopped, and I was left staring out at empty sky, wondering if I'd experienced a vivid dream or something that challenged basic assumptions about what can survive and move through the upper atmosphere. I spent the rest of the flight watching the window, hoping to see the figure return or to spot other anomalous objects in the sky around us. But the remainder of the journey was completely normal, with nothing but stars and occasional city lights visible through the aircraft windows. When we landed in Chicago, I considered reporting what I'd observed to the airline or to aviation authorities. But I had no evidence beyond my own testimony, and I was certain that reporting an encounter with an unidentified flying humanoid would raise more questions about my reliability than about aerial phenomena. Instead, I researched similar incidents online, looking for other reports of encounters with entities observed from commercial aircraft. What I found was a small but consistent collection of accounts from pilots and passengers who had observed humanoid figures at high altitude, usually during nighttime flights over remote areas. The reports shared common details: figures that appeared to be flying without mechanical assistance, entities that could match the speed of commercial aircraft, and beings that showed interest in examining or interacting with the planes they encountered. Most accounts mention the complete absence of any response from aircraft instruments, suggesting that whatever these entities were, they didn't register on radar or other detection systems. Several pilot reports described similar tapping sounds on cockpit windows, accompanied by sightings of large humanoid shapes that maintained position relative to the aircraft for extended periods. In some cases, the entities appeared to be conducting systematic examinations of the aircraft, moving around the exterior and seeming to study different components with obvious intelligence and purpose. What struck me about these accounts was their consistency across different time periods, geographical locations, and types of witnesses. Commercial pilots, military aviators, and civilian passengers had all reported encounters with flying humanoids that operated at altitudes and speeds that should be impossible for any known biological entity. I've taken dozens of flights since that November night, and I always request window seats, hoping to see something similar to what I encountered over Colorado. But the skies have remained normal, filled only with stars, weather patterns, and the occasional conventional aircraft visible in the distance. The experience changed how I think about air travel and what might share the high-altitude environment with commercial aviation. Somewhere in the thin air above 30,000 feet, entities exist that can survive and navigate in conditions that would be instantly fatal to humans. They move through our flight paths with intelligence and purpose, occasionally making contact with aircraft in ways that suggest curiosity rather than hostility. The figure that tapped on my airplane window was real, physical, and clearly interested in the aircraft and its occupants. Whether it was examining our technology, attempting communication, or simply satisfying curiosity about the strange metal objects that pass through its atmospheric domain, it represented capabilities that exist far beyond anything acknowledged in official aviation or atmospheric science. Commercial aviation operates on the assumption that the high-altitude environment is empty except for weather patterns and other aircraft. But my experience suggests that we share the skies with entities that have adapted to or originated in the extreme conditions of the upper atmosphere, beings that occasionally reveal themselves to travelers who happen to be looking out their windows at the right moment to witness encounters that challenge everything we think we know about what lives and moves through the airspace above our heads. The tapping on my window was deliberate communication from something that exists in the spaces between Earth and space, in the thin air where commercial aircraft briefly intrude on territories that belong to entities whose presence reminds us that even the familiar environment of commercial flight contains mysteries that operate beyond the boundaries of official acknowledgement and scientific understanding. We bought the house in November, moving in just before the first snow of what would turn out to be a particularly harsh Minnesota winter. It was a 1950s ranch style home in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, the kind of solid, unpretentious place that appealed to us as first time homeowners. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years before moving to a retirement community, and they'd left behind the usual remnants of a long occupancy, a few pieces of furniture we'd agreed to take, some gardening tools in the garage, and various electronic devices that were too outdated to be worth moving. Among the items they'd left was an old baby monitor sitting on a shelf in what had clearly been a child's bedroom. It was the kind with a simple base station and a portable receiver, probably from the 1990s based on the design and the fact that it used rechargeable batteries that were long dead. Sarah and I laughed about it when we found it, joking about the optimism of leaving baby gear for a couple in their 30s who had never expressed any interest in having children. We tossed the monitor into a box with other miscellaneous items that we planned to donate to charity, but somehow it never made it out of the house. The box sat in our bedroom closet for weeks, and eventually we forgot about its contents entirely. Life got busy with the process of settling into a new home, new jobs, and the social dynamics of a new neighborhood. It was sometime in January when we first heard the voice. I was working late in my home office, catching up on some freelance projects, when I heard what sounded like a child talking somewhere in the house. It was faint and indistinct, just murmured conversation that seemed to be coming from the directions of our bedroom. I assumed Sarah was watching television or talking on the phone, so I didn't investigate immediately. But when Sarah came into my office a few minutes later to say goodnight, I realized she'd been in the kitchen for the past hour, nowhere near our bedroom. When I mentioned hearing voices, she looked puzzled and said she hadn't heard anything unusual. We walked through the house together, checking each room for any source of the voices I'd heard. All the televisions were off, no radios were playing, and our neighbors' houses were too far away for us to hear conversations through the walls. Eventually, we decided I'd probably heard something from outside, maybe people walking by on the sidewalk or the sound carrying strangely through the winter air. 3 nights later, Sarah woke me up around 2 a.m., shaking my shoulder gently but insistently. She whispered. I lay still and listened. From somewhere in the house came the soft sound of a child's voice, speaking in the kind of sing-song rhythm that children use when they're playing alone or talking to themselves. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably that of a young child, maybe 3 or 4 years old. We got up and followed the sound through the house, and it led us to our bedroom closet. The voice was definitely coming from inside the closet, from the direction of the box we'd never gotten around to donating. When I opened the closet door and moved some clothes aside, the talking stopped immediately. I pulled out the box and found the old baby monitor. The receiver was sitting on top, and its power light was glowing green despite the fact that we'd never plugged it in or charged the supposedly dead batteries. When I picked up the receiver, it was warm to the touch, as if it had been operating for hours. "That's impossible," Sarah said, examining the device. I checked the base station, which we found still wrapped in the original packaging at the bottom of the box. It wasn't plugged into anything, had no batteries installed, and showed no signs of having been activated. Yet somehow, the receiver had been operating and picking up transmissions from somewhere. We spent the next hour trying to figure out how the monitor could have been working. I tested various combinations of settings and frequencies, thinking maybe it was picking up signals from baby monitors in neighboring houses. But the houses in our neighborhood were too far apart for that kind of interference, and when I scanned through all the available channels, I found only static. Sarah suggested we just get rid of the monitor, donate it along with the other items we'd been meaning to clear out. But I was genuinely curious about what we'd heard and how a supposedly non-functional device had been producing clear audio signals. I convinced her to let me keep it for a few days while I researched baby monitor frequencies and potential sources of interference. I set up the receiver on my desk in the home office, positioning it where I could monitor it while I worked. For 2 days, it remained silent, just a plastic device with a glowing power light, showing no signs of the mysterious transmissions we'd heard earlier. On the third night, the voice came back. I was reading in bed around 11 p.m. when I heard the familiar sound of a child talking from the direction of my office. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a digital recorder and hurried to the desk where I'd left the baby monitor receiver. The child's voice was clear and distinct, coming through the monitor's speaker with the kind of clarity that suggested the transmission source was very close by. But what I heard made my hands shake as I held the recorder. "Mommy said not to go outside when it's dark," the voice said in the matter-of-fact tone that children use when reciting rules they've been taught. "But I can see the lights in the backyard." I looked out my office window toward our backyard, but it was dark except for the occasional streetlight glow filtering through bare winter trees. There were no lights moving around, no signs of anything that a child might find interesting enough to watch. The voice continued. "Daddy is sleeping in the big chair again. He always sleeps there now." I recorded nearly 10 minutes of similar observations, a child's commentary on what appeared to be their daily life, delivered in the kind of stream of consciousness way that young children talk when they're processing their experiences out loud. The child described family routines, discussed toys and games, and occasionally asked questions as if they were talking to an adult who was present but whose responses weren't picked up by the monitor. When the transmission finally ended, I played back my recording for Sarah. The quality was clear enough that we could make out every word, and the voice was definitely that of a young child, probably a girl, based on the pitch and intonation. Sarah asked. I'd been wondering the same thing. We knew most of our immediate neighbors, and none of them had children young enough to match the voice we were hearing. The houses on either side of us were occupied by couples in their 60s, and the family across the street had teenagers, not preschoolers. Over the following weeks, the transmissions became more frequent and more detailed. Almost every night, we'd hear the child's voice coming through the baby monitor, describing activities and interactions that painted a picture of a family life that seemed both normal and somehow troubled. The child often mentioned parents who seemed to be having difficulties, a father who slept in chairs instead of beds, a mother who cried when she thought no one was looking, arguments that happened after bedtime when the child was supposed to be asleep. The observations were delivered without judgment or apparent understanding of their significance, just a child's honest reporting of the adult world they were witnessing. What made these transmissions particularly unsettling was their consistency. The child described the same house layout that matched our own home, mentioned looking out windows that corresponded to the windows in our house, and referred to rooms and features that suggested they were living in the same physical space we occupied. But the family life being described was clearly different from our own. The child talked about furniture we didn't have, mentioned family pets we'd never owned, and described daily routines that didn't match anything Sarah and I had ever experienced in the house. I started researching the history of our home, thinking that maybe the transmissions were somehow connected to previous occupants. What I learned from neighbors and public records was troubling but not entirely surprising. In the late 1980s, the house had been occupied by a young family, parents in their 30s, with a 4-year-old daughter named Emma. The family had experienced a series of tragic events during their time in the house. The father had lost his job and had struggled with depression and alcohol abuse. The mother had been overwhelmed by financial stress and the responsibility of caring for both her husband and her daughter. The situation had culminated in a murder-suicide in January 1989. The father had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life, all of them found in the house by concerned neighbors who hadn't seen the family for several days. The elderly couple we'd bought the house from had purchased it from the bank a year after the tragedy, living there peacefully for 4 decades without ever reporting any unusual experiences. But they'd kept the child's bedroom largely unchanged, maintaining it as a guest room, but preserving many of the original features that had been there when Emma lived in the house. I realized that the voice coming through the baby monitor was describing the final weeks of Emma's life, transmitting across more than 30 years to document the decline of a family that had ended in tragedy. The observations about her father sleeping in chairs, her mother crying, the arguments after bedtime, all of it was the innocent perspective of a child who was witnessing the disintegration of her world without understanding what it meant. We stopped listening to the monitor after that, packing it away in the garage where we couldn't hear its nightly transmissions. But sometimes, late at night when the house is particularly quiet, I can still hear the faint sound of a child's voice coming from somewhere in the walls, still describing the lights in the backyard, still asking questions that will never be answered, still documenting a family life that ended decades ago, but somehow continues to broadcast its final moments to anyone willing to listen. The baby monitor is still in our garage, probably still receiving transmissions from a time when Emma was alive and unaware that her observations were being recorded for posterity. We don't have a baby, but we live in a house where a child's voice still echoes through electronic devices, still trying to make sense of a world that was falling apart around her, still broadcasting her innocence into a future where her story serves as a reminder that some tragedies leave echoes that persist long after the original sounds have faded away.